John bleeding. I dreamed that morning broke over the plateau, and I saw John rise up, white and dirty in the new twilight.
Who's it dog?
He looked all round him and saw nothing but the heath. Then he walked this way and that, still looking, and so for a long time. And at last he sat down and wept, that also for a long time. And when he had wept enough, he rose like a man determined, and resumed his journey southward. He had hardly gone 20 paces when he stopped with a cry, for there lay Virtue at his feet. I understood in my dream that during his groping in the darkness he had unwittingly gone further and further from the place where they had first sat down. In a moment John was on his knees and feeling for Virtue's heart. It beat still. He laid his face to Virtue's lips. They breathed still. He caught him by the shoulder and shook him. "Wake up," he cried. "The morning is here." Then Virtue opened his eyes and smiled at John, a little foolishly. "Are you well?" said John. "Are you fit to travel?" But Virtue only smiled. He was dumb. Then John held out his hands and pulled Virtue to his feet, and Virtue stood up uncertainly. But as soon as he made a stride, he stumbled and fell, for he was blind. It was long before John understood. Then at last I saw him take Virtue by the hand, and leading him resume their journey to the south. And there fell upon John that last loneliness which comes when the comforter himself needs comforting, and the guide is to be guided. 3. The main road again. They found Mr. Sensible's house empty, as John had expected, with the shutters up and the chimneys smokeless. John decided to push on to the main road, and then, if the worst came to the worst, they could go to Mother Kirk. But he hoped it would not come to that. All their journey south had been a descent from the northern mountains to Mr. Sensible's, but after his house it began to rise again a little to the main road, which ran along a low ridge, so that when they had gained the road, the country south of it was suddenly all opened before them. At the same moment there came a gleam of sunshine, the first for many days. The road was unfenced to the heath on its northern side, but in its southern side there was a hedge with a gate in it, and the first thing John saw through the gate was a long, low mound of earth. He had not been a farmer's son for nothing. Having led Virtue to the bank of the road and seated him, he lost no time in climbing the gate and digging with both hands into the earthen mound. It contained, as he had expected, turnips, and in a minute he was seated by Virtue, cutting a fine root into chunks, feeding the blind man and teaching him how to feed himself. The sun grew warmer every moment. The spring seemed further on in this place, and the hedge behind them was already more green than brown. Among many notes of birds, John thought he would distinguish a lark. They had breakfasted well, and as the warmth increased pleasantly over their aching limbs, they fell asleep. 4. Going south. When John awoke, his first look was towards Virtue, but Virtue was still sleeping. John stretched himself and rose. He was warm and well, but a little thirsty. It was a four-cross road where they had been sitting, for the northern road at which John looked with a shudder was but the continuation of a road from the south. He stood and looked down the latter. To his eyes, long now accustomed to the dusty flats of the northern plateau, the country southward was as a rich counterpane. The sun had passed noon by an hour or so, and the slanting light freckled with rounded shadows a green land that fell ever away before him, opening as it sank into valleys, and beyond then into deeper valleys again, so that places on the same level where now he stood yonder were mountain tops. Nearer hand were fields and hedgerows, ruddy ploughland, winding woods, and frequent farmhouses white among their trees. He went back and raised Virtue, and was about to show it all to him, when he remembered his blindness. Then, sighing, he took him by the hand and went down the new road. Before they had gone far, he heard a bubbling sound by the roadside, and found a little spring pouring itself into a stream that ran henceforth with the road, now at the left, now at the right, and often crossed their way. He filled his hat with water and gave Virtue to drink. Then he drank himself, and they went on, always downhill. The road nestled deeper each half-mile between banks of grass. There were primroses, first one or two, then clustered, then innumerable. From many turns of the road, John caught sight of the deeper valleys to which they were descending, blue with distance and rounded with the weight of trees, but often a little wood cut off all remoter prospect. The first house they came to was a red house, old and ivied, and well back from the road, and John thought it had the look of a steward's house. As they came nearer, there was the steward himself, without his mask, pottering about at some light gardening labour on the sunny side of the hedge. John leaned over the gate and asked for hospitality, explaining at the same time his friend's condition. "Come in, said the steward. "It will be a great pleasure." Now I dreamed that this steward was the same Mr. Broad who had sent a case of sherry to Mr. Sensible. He was about 60 years of age. 5. Tea on the lawn. "It is almost warm enough to have tea on the lawn," said Mr. Broad. "Martha, I think we will have tea on the lawn." Chairs were set, and all three sat down. On the smooth lawn, surrounded by laurels and laburnum, it was even warmer than in the road, and suddenly a sweet bird note shot out from the thickets. "Listen," said Mr. Broad, "it is a thrush. I really believe it is a thrush." Maidservants in snowy aprons opened the long windows of the library and came over the grass carrying tables and trays, the silver teapot and the stand of cakes. There was honey for tea. Mr. Broad asked John some questions about his travels. "Dear me," he said when he heard of Mr. Savage. "Dear me, I ought to go and see him. And such a clever man, too, by your account. It is very sad." John went on to describe the three pale men. "Ah, to be sure," said Mr. Broad. "I knew their father very well. A very able man. I owed a good deal to him at one time. Indeed, as a young man, he formed my mind. I suppose I ought to go and see his boys. Young Angular I have met. He is a dear, good fellow. A little narrow, I would venture to say even a little old-fashioned, though of course I wouldn't for the world. The two brothers are doing splendidly, I have no doubt. I really ought to go and see them, but I am getting on, and I confess it never suits me up there." "It is a very different climate from this," said John. "I always think it is possible for a place to be too bracing. They call it the land of the tough-minded. Tough-skinned would be a better name if one has a tendency to lumbago. But, dear me, if you have come from there, you must have met my old friend Sensible. You know him, too?" "Know him? He is my oldest friend. He is a kind of connection of mine, and then, you know, we are quite near neighbours. He is only a mile north of the road, and I am about a mile south of it. I should think I did know him. I have passed many, many happy hours in his house. The dear old man, poor Sensible, he is aging fast. I don't think he has ever quite forgiven me for having kept most of my hair." "I should have thought his views differed from yours a good deal." "Ah, to be sure, to be sure. He is not very orthodox, perhaps, but as I grow older, I am inclined to set less and less store by mere orthodoxy. So often the orthodox view means the lifeless view, the barren formula. I am coming to look more and more at the language of the heart. Logic and definition divide us. It is those things which draw us together that I now value most, our common affections, our common delight in this slow pageant of the countryside, our common struggle towards the light. Sensible's heart is in the right place." "I wonder," said John, "if he treats that servant of his very well." "His language is a little bit rough, I suppose. One must be charitable. You young people are so hard. Dear me, I remember when I was a boy myself. And then a man of Sensible's age suffers a good deal. We are none of us perfect. Will you not have a little more tea?" "Thank you," said John. "But if you can give me some directions, I think I would like to continue my journey. I am trying to find an island in the west." "That is a beautiful idea," said Mr. Broad. "And if you will trust an older traveller, the seeking is the finding. How many happy days you have before you." "And I want to know," continued John, "whether it is really necessary to cross the canyon." "To be sure you do. I wouldn't for the world hold you back. At the same time..."
I want to point this out. So there's this book in the Bible, and there's a quotation from it that people use quite often. And they say, "If a man don't work, he shouldn't eat." There's also a place in the Bible, I believe in Galatians, where it says that if a man comes to you and needs to work, you provide him work. Alright, I just said it. Thank you very much. Enjoy the tale of the way that I was growing up, man.
My dear boy, I think there is a very real danger at your age of trying to make these things too definite. That has been the great error of my profession in past ages. We have tried to enclose everything in formulae, to turn poetry into logic and metaphor into dogma, and now that we are beginning to realize our mistake, we find ourselves shackled by the formulae of dead men. I don't say that they were not adequate once, but they have ceased to be adequate for us with our wider knowledge. When I became a man, I put away childish things. These great truths need reinterpretation in every age.
No, they don't.
I'm not sure that I quite understand, said John. Do you mean that I must cross the canyon, or that I must not? I see you want to pin me down, said Mr. Broad with a smile. And I love to see it. I was like that myself once, but one loses faith in abstract logic as one grows older. Do you never feel that the truth is so great and so simple that no mere words can contain it? The heaven and the heaven of heavens, how much less this house that I have builded? Well, anyway, said John, deciding to try a new question, supposing a man did have to cross the canyon, is it true that he would have to rely on Mother Kirk? Ah, Mother Kirk, I love and honor her from the bottom of my heart, but I trust that loving her does not mean being blind to her faults. We are none of us infallible. If I sometimes feel that I must differ from her at present, it is because I honor all the more the idea that she stands for, the thing she may yet become. For the moment, there is no denying that she has let herself get a little out of date. Surely, for many of our generation, there is a truer, a more acceptable message in all this beautiful world around us. I don't know whether you are anything of a botanist. If you would care, I want my island, said John. Can you tell me how to reach it? I'm afraid I'm not specially interested in botany. It would open a new world to you, said Mr. Broad, a new window on the infinite. But perhaps this is not in your line. We must all find our own key to the mystery, after all. I wouldn't for the world. I think I must be going, said John, and I have enjoyed myself very much. If I follow this road, shall I find anywhere that will give me a night's lodging in a few miles? Oh, easily, said Mr. Broad. I should be very glad to have you here if you would care to stay. But if not, there is Mr. Wisdom within an easy walk. You will find him a delightful man. I used to go and see him quite often when I was younger, but it is a little too far for me now. A dear, good fellow, a little persistent, perhaps. I sometimes wonder if he is really quite free from a trace of narrow-mindedness. You should hear what Sensible says about him. But there, we are none of us perfect, and he is a very good sort of man on the whole. You will like him very much. The old steward bade goodbye to John with almost fatherly kindness, and John, still leading Virtue, pursued his journey. 6. The House of Wisdom. The stream that they had followed to the steward's house was now no longer a brook by the roadside, but a river that sometimes approached, sometimes receded from the road, sliding in swift amber reaches and descending silver rapids. The trees grew more thickly hereabouts and were of larger kinds, and as the valley deepened, tiers of forest rose one above the other on each side. They walked in shadow, but far above their heads the sun was still shining on the mountain tops, beyond the forest slopes, and beyond the last steep fields, where there were domed summits of pale grass and winding water glens, and cliffs the colour of doves, and cliffs the colour of wine. The moths were already flying when they reached an open place. The valley widened, and a loop of the river made room for a wide and level lawn between its banks and the wooded mountains. Amidst the lawn stood a low, pillared house approachable by a bridge, and the door stood open. John led the sick man up to them and saw that the lamps were already lit within, and then he saw Wisdom sitting among his children like an old man. "You may stay here as long as you wish," he said in answer to John's question, "and it may be that we shall heal your friend if his sickness is not incurable. Sit and eat, and when you have eaten, you shall tell us your story." Then I saw that chairs were brought for the travellers, and some of the young men of the house carried water to them to wash. And when they had washed, a woman set a table before them and laid on it a loaf, and cheese, and a dish of fruit with some curds, and buttermilk in a pitcher. "For we can get no wine here," said the old man with a sigh. When the meal was over, there was silence in the house, and John saw that they waited for his story. So he collected himself, and cast back in his mind a long time in silence. And when at last he spoke, he told the whole thing in order, from the first sight he had had of the island down to his arrival among them. Then Virtue was led away from John, and he himself was brought into a cell where there was a bed and a table and a pitcher of water. He lay on the bed, and it was hard, but not lumpy, and he was immediately in a deep sleep. 7. Across the canyon by moonlight. In the middle of the night he opened his eyes and saw the full moon, very large and low, shining at his window, and beside his bed stood a woman darkly clothed, who held up her hand for silence when he would have spoken. "My name is Contemplation," she said, "and I am one of the daughters of Wisdom. You must rise and follow me." Then John rose and followed her out of the house onto the grassy lawn in the moonlight. She led him across it to its westward edge, where the mountain began to rise under its cloak of forest. But as they came right up to the eaves of the forest, he saw that there was a crack or a crevasse in the earth between them and it, to which he could find no bottom, and though it was not very wide, it was too wide to jump. "It is too wide a jump by day," said the lady, "but in the moonlight you can jump it." John felt no doubt of her, and gathered himself together and leapt. His leap carried him further than he had intended, though he felt no surprise, and he found himself flying over the tree-tops and the steep fields, and he never alighted till he reached the mountain-top, and the lady was there by his side. "Come," she said, "we have still far to go." Then they went on together over hills and dales, very fast in the moonlight, till they came to the edge of a cliff, and he looked down and saw the sea below him, and out in the sea lay the island. And because it was moonlight and night, John could not see it so well as he had sometimes seen it, but either for that reason or some other, it seemed to him the more real. "When you have learned to fly further, we can leap from here right into the island," said the lady, "but for this night it is enough." As John turned to answer her, the island and the sea and the lady herself vanished, and he was awake in daylight in his cell in the House of Wisdom, and a bell was ringing. 8. This side by sunlight. On the next day, Mr. Wisdom caused John and Virtue both to sit by him in a porch of his house looking westward. The wind was in the south, and the sky was a little clouded, and over the western mountains there was a delicate mist, so that they had the air of being in another world, though they were not more than a mile away, and Mr. Wisdom instructed them. "As to this island in the west, and those eastern mountains, and as touching the landlord also and the enemy, there are 2 errors, my sons, which you must equally conquer and pass right between them, before you can become wise. The first error is that of the southern people, and it consists in holding that these eastern and western places are real places. Real as this valley is real, and places as this valley is a place. If any such thought lingers in your minds, I would have you root it out utterly, and give no quarter to that thought, whether it threatens you with fear or tempts you with hopes. For this is superstition, and all who believe it will come in the end to the swamps and the jungles of the far south, where they will live in the city of magicians, transported with delight in things that help not, and haunted with terror of that which cannot hurt. And it is part of the same error to think that the landlord is a real man, real as I am real, man as I am man. That is the first error. And the second is the opposite of it, and is chiefly current to the north of the road. It is the error of those who say that the eastern and western things are merely illusions in our own minds. This also it is my will that you should utterly reject. And you must be on your guard lest you ever embrace this error in your fear of the other, or run to and fro between the two as your hearts will prompt you to do, like some who will be materialists, for that is the name of the second error, when the story of the black hole frightens them for their lawless living, or even when they are afraid of spectres, and then another day will believe in the landlord and the castle, because things in this country go hard with them, or because the lease of some dear friend is running out, and they would gladly hope to meet him again. But the wise man, ruling his passions with reason and disciplined imagination, withdraws himself to the middle point between these 2 errors, having found that the truth lies there and remains fixed immovably. But what that truth is you shall learn tomorrow. And for the present this sick man will be cared for, and you who are whole may do as you will." Then I saw Mr. Wisdom rise and leave them, and Virtue was taken to another place. John spent the most part of that day walking in the neighbourhood of the house. He crossed the level grass of the valley and came to its western edge, where the mountain began to rise under its cloak of forest. But as he came under the forest eaves, he saw that between him and the first trees there was a crack or crevasse in the earth to which he could find no bottom. It was very narrow, but not quite narrow enough to jump. There seemed also to be some vapour rising from it, which made the further side indistinct. But the vapour was not so thick, nor the chasm so wide, but that he could see here a spray of foliage, and there a stone with deep moss, and in one place falling water that caught the sunlight. His desire to pass and go on to the island was sharp, but not to the degree of pain. Mr. Wisdom's words that the eastern and western things were neither wholly real nor wholly illusion had spread over his mind a feeling of intent yet quiet comfort. Some fear was removed. The suspicion, never before wholly laid at rest, that his wanderings might lead him soon or late into the power of the landlord, had passed away, and with it the gnawing anxiety lest the island had never existed. The world seemed full of expectation, even as the misty veil between him and the forest seemed both to cover and discover sublimities that were without terror and beauties without sensuality. And every now and then a strengthening of the south wind would make a moment's clearness, and show him, withdrawn in unexpected depth, remote reaches of the mountain valleys, desolate fields of flowers, the hint of snow beyond. He lay down in the grass. Presently one of the young men of the house passed that way and stopped to talk with him. They spoke of this and that, lazily and at long intervals. Sometimes they discussed the regions further south, where John had not been, sometimes his own travels. The young man told him that if he had followed the road a few miles beyond the valley, he would have come to a fork. The left-hand turn would lead you, by a long way round, to the parts about Claptrap. The right went on to the southern forests, to the city of the magicians and the country of Nycteris. "And beyond that it is all swamp and sugar-cane," said he, "and crocodiles and venomous spiders, until the land sinks away altogether into the final salt swamp, which becomes at last the southern ocean. There are no settlements there except a few lake-dwellers, theosophists and what not, and it is very malarial." While they were speaking of the parts that John already knew, he asked his informant whether they in the House of Wisdom knew anything of the Grand Canyon or of the way down into it. "Do you not know," said the other, "that we are in the bottom of the canyon here?" Then he made John sit up and showed him the lie of the land. The sides of the valley drew together northward and at the same time grew more precipitous, so that at last they came together into a great V. "And that V is the canyon, and you are looking into it endways from the southern end. The eastern face of the canyon is gentle, and you were walking down into it all day yesterday, though you did not notice it." "So I am in the bottom of it already," said John, "and now there is nothing to prevent me from crossing it." The young man shook his head. "There is no crossing it," he said. "When I told you we were now at the bottom, I meant the lowest point that can be reached by man. The real bottom is, of course, the bottom of this crevasse which we are sitting by, and that, of course, well, it would be a misunderstanding to talk of getting down it. There is no question of crossing, or of getting to what you see over there." "Could it not be bridged?" said John. "In a sense there is nothing to bridge. There is nowhere for this bridge to arrive at. You must not take literally the show of forest and mountain which we seem to see as we look across." "You don't mean that it is an illusion?" "No, you will understand better when you have been longer with my father. It is not an illusion, it is an appearance. It is a true appearance, too, in a sense. You must see it as a mountainside or the like, a continuation of the world we do know, and it does not mean that there is anything wrong with your eyes, or any better way of seeing it to which you can attain, but don't think you can get there. Don't think there is any meaning in the idea of you, a man, going there, as if it were really a place." "What? And the island too? You would have me give up my heart's desire?" "I would not. I would not have you cease to fix all your desires on the far side, for to wish to cross is simply to be a man, and to lose that wish is to be a beast. It is not desire that my father's doctrine kills, it is only hope." "And what is this valley called?" "We call it now simply Wisdom's Valley, but the oldest maps mark it as the Valley of Humiliation." "The grass is quite wet," said John after a pause. "The dew is beginning." "It is time that we went to supper," said the young man. 9. Wisdom, exoteric. Next day, as before, Wisdom had John and Virtue into the porch and continued to instruct them. "You have heard what you are not to think of the Eastern and Western things, and now let us discover, as far as the imperfection of our faculty allows, what may rightly be thought. At first, consider this country in which we live. You see that it is full of roads, and no man remembers the making of these roads. Neither have we any way to describe and order the land in our minds except by reference to them. You have seen how we determine the position of every other place by its relation to the main road, and though you may say that we have maps, you are to consider that the maps will be useless without the roads. For we find where we are on the map by the skeleton of roads which is common to it and to the country. We see that we have just passed such a turn to the right or the left, or that we are approaching such a bend in the road, and thus we know that we are near to some other place on the map which is not yet visible on the countryside. The people indeed say that the landlord made these roads, and the Claptrappians say that we first made them on the map, and have projected them by some strange process from it to the country. But I would have you hold fast to the truth, that we find them and do not make them, but also that no man could make them. For to make them he would need a bird's-eye view of the whole country, which he could have only from the sky. But no man could live in the sky. Again, this country is full of rules. The Claptrappians say that the stewards made the rules. The servants of the giants say that we made them ourselves in order to restrain by them the lusts of our neighbours, and to give a pompous colouring to our own. The people say that the landlord made them. Let us consider these doctrines one by one. The stewards made them? How then came they to be stewards, and why did the rest of us consent to their rules? As soon as we ask this question, we are obliged to ask another. How comes it that those who have rejected the stewards immediately set about making new rules of their own, and that these new rules are substantially the same as the old? A man says, "I have finished with rules, henceforth I will do what I want." But he finds that his deepest want, the only want that is constant through the flux of his appetites and despondencies, his moments of calm and of passion, is to keep the rules. Because these rules are a disguise for his desires, say the giants following. But I ask, what desires? Not any and every desire. The rules are frequently denials of these desires. The desire for self-approbation, shall we say. But why should we approve ourselves for keeping the rules unless we already thought that the rules were good? A man may find pleasure in supposing himself swifter or stronger than he really is, but only if he already loves speed or strength. The giant's doctrine thus destroys itself. If we wish to give a seemly colouring to our lusts, we have already the idea of the seemly, and the seemly turns out to be nothing else than that which is according to the rules. The want to obey the rules is this presupposed in every doctrine which describes our obedience to them, or the rules themselves, as a self-flattery. Let us turn then to the old tale of the landlord. Some mighty man beyond this country has made the rules. Suppose he has. Then why do we obey them? Mr. Wisdom turned to Virtue and said, "This part is of great concern to you and to your cure." Then he continued, "There can be only two reasons. Either because we respect the power of the landlord and are moved by fear of the penalties and hopes of the rewards with which he sanctions the rules, or else because we freely agree with the landlord, because we also think good the things that he thinks good. But neither explanation will serve. If we obey through hope and fear, in that very act we disobey. For the rule which we reverence most, whether we find it in our own hearts or on the steward's card, is that rule which says that a man must act disinterestedly. To obey the landlord thus would be to disobey. But what if we obey freely because we agree with him? Alas, this is even worse. To say that we agree and obey because we agree is only to say again that we find the same rule written in our hearts and obey that. If the landlord enjoins that, he enjoins only what we already propose to do, and his voice is idle. If he enjoins anything else, his voice again is idle, for we shall disobey him. In either case, the mystery of the rule remains unsolved, and the landlord is a meaningless addition to the problem. If he spoke, the rules were there before he spoke. If we and he agree about them, where is the common original which he and we both copy? What is the thing about which his doctrine and ours are both true? Of the rules, then, as of the roads, we must say that indeed we find them and do not make them, but that it helps us not at all to assume a landlord for their maker. And there is a third thing also. Here he looked to John, which specially concerns you. What of the island in the west? The people in our age have all but forgotten it. The giant would say that it is, again, a delusion in your own mind, trumped up to conceal lust. Of the stewards, some do not know that there is such a thing. Some agree with the giant, denouncing your island as wickedness. Some say that it is a blurred and confused sight from far off of the landlord's castle. They have no common doctrine, but let us consider the question for ourselves. And first I would have you set aside all suspicion that the giant is right, and this will be the easier for you because you have already talked with reason. They say it is there to conceal lust, but it does not conceal lust. If it is a screen, it is a very bad screen. The giant would make the dark part of our mind so strong and subtle that we never escape from its deceptions. And yet when this omnipotent conjurer has done all that he can, he produces an illusion which a solitary boy in the fancies of his adolescence can expose and see through in 2 years. This is but wild talk. There is no man and no nation at all capable of seeing the island who have not learned by experience, and that soon, how easily the vision ends in lust. And there is none also, not corrupted, who has not felt the disappointment of that ending, who has not known that it is the breaking of the vision, not its consummation. The words between you and reason were true. What does not satisfy when we find it was not the thing we were desiring. If water will not set a man at ease, then be sure it was not thirst, or not thirst only, that tormented him. He wanted drunkenness to cure his dullness, or talk to cure his solitude, or the like. How, indeed, do we know our desires save by their satisfaction? When do we know them until we say, "Ah, this was what I wanted"? And if there were any desire which it was natural for man to feel, but impossible for man to satisfy, would not the nature of this desire remain to him always ambiguous? If old tales were true, if a man without putting off humanity could indeed pass the frontiers of our country, if he could be, and yet be a man, in that fabled East and fabled West, then indeed, at the moment of fruition, the raising of the cup, the assumption of the crown, the kiss of the spouse, then first, to his backward glance, the long roads of desire that he had trodden would become plain in all their winding, and when he found, he would know what it was that he had sought. I am old and full of tears, and I see that you also begin to feel the sorrow that is born with us. Abandon hope, do not abandon desire. Feel no wonder that these glimpses of your island so easily confuse themselves with viler things, and are so easily blasphemed. Above all, never try to keep them, never try to revisit the same place, or time wherein the vision was accorded to you. You will pay the penalty of all who would bind down to one place or time within our country that which our country cannot contain. Have you not heard from the stewards of the sin of idolatry, and how in their old chronicles the manna turned to worms if any tried to hoard it? Be not greedy, be not passionate. You will but crush dead on your own breast with hot, rough hands the thing you loved. But if ever you incline to doubt that the thing you long for is something real, remember what your own experience has taught you. Think that it is a feeling, and at once the feeling has no value. Stand sentinel at your own mind, watching for that feeling, and you will find, what shall I say, a flutter in the heart, an image in the head, a sob in the throat. And was that your desire? You know that it was not, and that no feeling whatever will appease you. That feeling, refine it as you will, is but one more spurious claimant, spurious as the gross lusts of which the giant speaks. Let us conclude, then, that what you desire is no state of yourself at all, but something, for that very reason, other and outer. And knowing this, you will find tolerable the truth that you cannot attain it. That the thing should be is so great a good that when you remember it is, you will forget to be sorry that you can never have it. Nay, anything that you could have would be so much less than this that its fruition would be immeasurably below the mere hunger for this. Wanting is better than having. The glory of any world wherein you can live is in the end appearance. But then, as one of my sons has said, that leaves the world more glorious yet. 10. Wisdom, esoteric. That day John spent as he had spent the other, wandering and often sleeping in the fields. In this valley the year came on with 7-leagued boots. Today the riverside was thick with fritillaries, the kingfisher flew, the dragonflies darted, and when he sat it was in the shade. A pleasing melancholy rested upon him, and a great indolence. He talked that day with many of the people of the house, and when he went that night to his cell, his mind was full of their resigned voices, and of their faces, so quiet and yet so alert, as though they waited in hourly expectation of something that would never happen. When next he opened his eyes, moonlight filled his cell, and as he lay waking, heard a low whistle from without his window. He put out his head. A dark figure stood in the shadow of the house. "Come out and play," said he. At the same time there came a sound of suppressed laughter from an angle of deeper shadow beyond the speaker. "This window is too high for me to jump from," said John. "You forget that it is by moonlight," said the other, and held up his hands. "Jump," he said. John cast some clothes about him and bounded from the window. To his surprise he reached the ground with no hurt or shock, and a moment later he found himself progressing over the lawn in a series of great leaps amidst a laughing crowd of the sons and daughters of the house, so that the valley in the moonlight, if any had watched, would have looked like nothing so much as a great salver which had been made into the arena for a troop of performing fleas. Their dance or race led them to the dark border of a neighbouring wood, and as John tumbled down breathless at the foot of a hawthorn, he heard with surprise all around him the sounds of silver and glass, of hampers opening and bottles uncorking. "My father's ideas of feeding are a little strict," explained his host, "and we younger ones have found it necessary to supplement the household meals a bit." "Here is champagne from Mr. Halfways," said one. "Cold chicken and tongue from Mr. Mammon. What should we do without our friends? Hashish from the south. Nectaris sent it up herself." "This claret," said a girl beside him rather shyly, "is from Mother Kirk." "I don't think we ought to drink that," said another voice. "That is really going a bit too far." "No further than your caviar from the Theosophists," said the first girl. "And anyway, I need it. It is only this that keeps me alive." "Try some of my brandy," said another voice. "All made by Savage's dwarfs." "I don't know how you can drink that stuff, Carl. Plain, honest food from Claptrap is what you need." "So you say, Herbert," retorted a new speaker, "but some of us find it rather heavy. For me, a morsel of lamb from the shepherd's country and a little mint sauce. That is really all you need to add to our father's table." "We all know what you like, Benedict," said several. "I have finished," announced Carl, "and now for a night with the dwarfs. Anyone come with me?" "Not there," cried another. "I'm going south tonight to the magicians." "You had much better not, Rudolph," said someone. "A few quiet hours in Puritania with me would be much better for you, much better." "Chuck it, Emmanuel," said another. "You might as well go to Mother Kirk straight away." "Bernard does," said the girl, who had contributed the claret. By this time the party was rapidly decreasing, for most of the young people, after trying in vain to win converts to their several schemes of pleasure, had bounded off alone, plunging from tree-top to tree-top, and soon even the thin, silvery sound of their laughter had died away. Those who were left swarmed round John, soliciting his attention now for this, now for that amusement. Some sat down beyond the shadow of the wood to work out puzzles in the light of the moon. Others settled to serious leapfrog. The more frivolous ran to and fro, chasing the moths, wrestling with and tickling one another, giggling and making giggle, till the wood rang with their shrill squeals of glee. It seemed to go on for a long time, and if there was any more in that dream, John did not remember it when he woke. 11. Mum's the word. At breakfast on the following morning, John stole many furtive glances at the sons and daughters of wisdom, but he could see no sign that they were conscious of having met him in such different guise during the night. Indeed, neither then, nor at any other time during his stay in the valley, did he find evidence that they were aware of their nocturnal holidays, and a few tentative questions assured him that, unless they were liars, they all believed themselves to be living exclusively on the spare diet of the house. Emmanuel indeed admitted, as a speculative truth, that there were such things as dreams, and that he conceivably dreamed himself, but then he had a complex proof, which John never quite grasped, that no one could possibly remember a dream, and though his appearance and constitution were those of a prize-fighter, he attributed this all to the excellent quality of the local fruit. Herbert was a lumpish sort of man who never could muster any appetite for his meals, but John discovered that Herbert put this down to his liver, and had no notion that he had been stuffing himself with claptrapian steak and gravy all night as hard as he could. Another of the family, Bernard by name, was in radiant health. John had seen him drinking Mother Kirk's wine with great relish and refreshment by moonlight, but the waking Bernard maintained that Mother Kirk's wine was merely a bad, early attempt at the admirable barley water which his father sometimes brought out on birthdays and great occasions. And, "To this barley water," he said, "I owe my health. It has made me what I am." Still less could John discover, by all the traps that he laid for them, whether the younger members of the household had any recollection of their nightly leapfrog and other gambols. He was forced at last to conclude that either the whole thing had been a private dream of his own, or else the secret was very well kept. A little irritation which some displayed when he questioned them seemed to favour the second hypothesis. 12. More wisdom. When they were seated in the porch, Wisdom continued his discourse. "You have learned that there are these three things, the island, the roads, and the rules, that they are certainly in some way real, and that we have not made them, and further that it does not help us to invent a landlord, nor is it possible that there should really be a castle at one end of the world and an island at the other, for the world is round, and we are everywhere at the end of the world, since the end of a sphere is its surface. The world is all end, but we can never pass beyond that end. And yet these things which our imagination impossibly places as a world beyond the world's end are, we have seen, in some sense, real. You have told me how reason refuted the lies of the giant by asking what was the colour of things in dark places. You learn from her that there is no colour without seeing, no hardness without touching, no body to say all save in the minds of those who perceive it. It follows then that all this choir of heaven and furniture of earth are imaginations, not your imaginations nor mine, for here we have met in the same world, which could not be if the world was shut up within my mind or yours. Without doubt, then, all this show of sky and earth floats within some mighty imagination. If you ask whose, again the landlord will not help you. He is man. Make him as great as you will, he still is other than we, and his imagining inaccessible to us, as yours would be to me. Rather we must say that the world is not in this mind or in that, but in mind itself, in that impersonal principle of consciousness which flows eternally through us, its perishable forms. You see how this explains all the questions that have lain on our knees since we began. We find the roads, the reasonable skeleton in the countryside, the guiding lines that enable us both to make maps and to use them when we have made, because our country is the offspring of the rational. Consider also the island. All that you know of it comes at last to this, that your first sight of it was yearning or wanting, and that you have never ceased to want that first sight back, as though you wanted a wanting, as though the wanting were the having and the having a wanting. What is the meaning of this hungry fruition and this emptiness which is the best filling? Surely it becomes plain when you have learned that no man says "I" in an unambiguous sense. I am an old man who must soon go over the brook and be seen no more. I am eternal mind in which time and place themselves are contained. I am the imaginer. I am one of his imaginations. The island is nothing else than that perfection and immortality which I possess as spirit eternal, and vainly crave as mortal soul. Its voices sound at my very ear, and are further than the stars. It is under my hand, and will never be mine. I have it, and lo, the very having is the losing, because at every moment I, as spirit, am indeed abandoning my rich estate to become that perishing and imperfect creature in whose repeated deaths and births stands my eternity. And I, as man, in every moment, still enjoy the perfection I have lost, since still, so far as I am at all, I am spirit, and only by being spirit maintain my short vitality as soul. See how life subsists by death, and each becomes the other. For spirit lives by dying perpetually into such things as we, and we also attain our truest life by dying to our mortal nature, and relapsing, as far as may be, into the impersonality of our source. For this is the final meaning of all moral precepts, and the goodness of temperance and justice and of love itself is that they plunge the red heat of our separate and individual passions back in the ice brook of the spirit, there to take eternal temper, though not endless duration. What I tell you is the Evangelium Aeternum. This has been known always. Ancients and moderns bear witness to it. The stories of the landlord in our own time are but a picture-writing which show to the people as much of the truth as they can understand. Stewards must have told you, though it seems that you neither heeded nor understood them, the legend of the landlord's son. They say that after the eating of the mountain apple and the earthquake, when things in our country had gone all awry, the landlord's son himself became one of his father's tenants, and lived among us for no other purpose than that he should be killed. The stewards themselves do not know clearly the meaning of their story. Hence, if you ask them how the slaying of the son should help us, they are driven to monstrous answers. But to us the meaning is clear and the story is beautiful. It is a picture of the life of spirit itself. What the son is in the legend, every man is in reality, for the whole world is nothing else than the eternal, thus giving itself to death, that it may live, that we may live. Death is life's mode, and the increase of life is through repeated death. And what of the rules? You have seen that it is idle to make them the arbitrary commands of a landlord. Yet those who do so are not altogether astray, for it is equally an error to think that they are each man's personal choice. Remember what we have said of the island. Because I am, and am not spirit, therefore I have, and have not my desire. The same double nature of the word I explain the rules. I am the lawgiver, but I am also the subject. I, the spirit, impose upon the soul which I become the laws she must henceforth obey. And every conflict between the rules and our inclinations is but a conflict of the wishes of my mortal and apparent self against those of my real and eternal. I ought, but I do not wish. How meaningless the words are, how close to saying, I want and I do not want. But once we have learned to say, I, and yet not I, want, the mystery is plain.
Oh, yeah.
And now your sick friend is almost whole, and it is nearly noon. Book 8. At Bay. He that hath understanding in himself is best. He that lays up his brother's wisdom in his breast is good. But he that neither knoweth nor will be taught by the instruction of the wise, this man is naught. Hesiod. Persons without education certainly do not want either acuteness or strength of mind in what concerns themselves, or in things immediately within their observation, but they have no power of abstraction. They see their objects always near, never in the horizon. Hazlitt. 1. Two kinds of monist. That afternoon, as John was walking in the water meadow, he saw a man coming towards him who walked blunderingly like one whose legs were not his own. And as the man came nearer, he saw that it was Virtue, with his face very pale. "What?" cried John. "Are you cured? Can you see? Can you speak?" "Yes," said Virtue in a weak voice. "I suppose I can see." And he leaned heavily on a stile and breathed hard. "You have walked too far," said John. "Are you ill?" "Oh, I'm still weak. It is nothing. I shall get my breath in a moment." "Sit down by me," said John, "and when you have rested we will go gently back to the house." "I'm not going back to the house." "Not going back? You are not fit to travel, and where are you going?" "I'm not fit for anything, apparently," said Virtue, "but I must go on." "Go on where? You are not still hoping to cross the canyon. Do you not believe what wisdom has told us?" "I do. That is why I am going on." "Sit down at least for a moment," said John, "and explain yourself." "It is plain enough." "It isn't plain at all." Virtue spoke impatiently. "Did you not hear what wisdom said about the rules?" he asked. "Of course I did," said John. "Well then, he has given me back the rules. That puzzle is solved. The rules have to be obeyed, as I always thought. I know that now better than I have ever known it before." "Well?" "And didn't you see what all the rest came to? The rules are from this spirit, or whatever he calls it, which is somehow also me, and any disinclination to obey the rules is the other part of me, the mortal part. Does it not follow from that, and from everything else he said, that the real disobedience to the rules begins with being in this country at all? This country is simply not the island, not the rules. That is its definition. My mortal self, that is for all practical purposes myself, can be defined only as the part of me that is against the rules. Just as the spirit answers to the landlord, so this whole world answers to the black hole." "I take it all exactly the other way," said John. "Rather, this world corresponds to the landlord's castle. Everything is this spirit's imagination, and therefore everything, properly understood, is good and happy." That the glory of this world in the end is appearance leaves the world more glorious yet. I quite agree that the rules, the authority of the rules, becomes stronger than ever, but their content must be, well, easier. Perhaps I should say richer, more concrete. Their content must become harsher if the real good is simply what is not here, and here means simply the place where the good is not. What can the real rule be except to live here as little as possible, to commit ourselves as little as we can to the system of this world? I used to talk of innocent pleasures, fool that I was, as if anything could be innocent for us whose mere existence is a fall, as if all that a man eats or drinks or begets were not propagated curse. Really, Virtue, this is a very strange view. The effect of Mr. Wisdom's lessons on me has been just the opposite. I've been thinking how much of the Puritanian virus there must still be in me to have held me back so long from the blameless generosity of nature's breasts. Is not the meanest thing, in its degree, a mirror of the one, the lightest or the wildest pleasure as necessary to the perfection of the whole as the most heroic sacrifice? I am assured that in the absolute, every flame even of carnal passion burns on. Can even eating, even the coarsest food and the barest pittance, be justified? The flesh is but a living corruption. There was a great deal to be said for Media, after all. I see that Savage was wiser than he knew. It is true she had a dark complexion, and yet is not brown as necessary to the spectrum as any other colour? Is not every colour equally a corruption of the white radiance? What we call evil, our greatest wickedness, seen in the true setting, is an element in the good. I am the doubter and the doubt. What we call our righteousness is filthy rags. You are a fool, John, and I'm going. I'm going up into the rocks till I find where the wind is coldest and the ground hardest and the life of man furthest away. My notice to quit has not yet come, and I must be stained a while longer with the dye of our country. I shall still be part of that dark cloud which offends the white light, but I shall make that part of the cloud which is called me as thin, as nearly not a cloud as I can. Body and mind shall pay for the crime of their existence. If there is any fasting or watching, any mutilation or self-torture more harsh to nature than another, I shall find it out. Are you mad? Said John. I have just become sane, said Virtue. Why are you staring at me thus? I know I am pale and my pulse beats like a hammer. So much the saner. Disease is better than health and sees clearer, for it is 1 degree nearer to the spirit, 1 degree less involved in the riot of our animal existence. But it will need stronger pains than this to kill the obscene thirst for life which I drank in with my mother's milk. Why should we leave this pleasant valley? John began. But Virtue cut him short. Who spoke of we? Do you think that I asked or expected you to accompany me? You to sleep on thorns and eat sloes? You don't mean that we are to part, said John. Pah, said Virtue. You could not do the things I intend to do, and if you could, I would have none of you. Friendship, affection, what are these but the subtlest chains that tie us to our present country? He will be a fool indeed who mortified the body and left the mind free to be happy, and thus still to affirm, to wallow in, a finite will. It is not this pleasure or that, but all that are to be cut off. No knife will cut deep enough to end the cancer, but I'll cut as deep as I can. He rose, still swaying, and continued his way over the meadow northward. He held his hand to his side as though he was in pain. Once or twice he nearly fell. "What are you following me for?" he shouted to John. "Go back!" John stopped for a moment, checked by the hatred in his friend's face. Then, tentatively, he went on again. He thought that Virtue's illness had harmed his brain and had some indistinct hope that he might find means to humour him and bring him back. Before they had gone many paces, however, Virtue turned again and lifted a stone in his hand. "Be off," he said, "or I'll throw it. We have nothing to do with one another, you and I. My own body and my own soul are enemies, and do you think I will spare you?" John halted, undetermined, and then ducked, for the other had hurled the stone. I saw them go on like this for some way, John following at a distance and stopping, and then continuing again, while Virtue every now and then stoned him and reviled him. But at last the distance between them was too great either for voice or stone to carry. 2. John led. As they went on thus, John saw that the valley narrowed and the sides of it grew steeper. At the same time, the crevasse on his left hand, which separated him from the western forest, became wider and wider, so that, what with that and with the narrowing of the valley as a whole, the level piece where they were travelling was constantly diminished. Soon it was no longer the floor of the valley, but only a ledge on its eastern side, and the crevasse revealed itself as being not a slot in the floor, but the very floor. John saw that he was, in fact, walking on a shelf halfway down one side of the Grand Canyon. The cliff towered above him. Presently a kind of spur or root of rock came out from the cliff and barred their way, crossing the ledge with a ruin of granite. And as Virtue began to scramble about the bases of this ascent, trying this grip and that to go up, John gained on him and came again within earshot. Before he came to the foot of the crags, however, Virtue had begun to climb. John heard his gasping as he struggled from hold to hold. Once he slipped back and left a little trail of blood where the rock skinned his ankle, but he went on again, and soon John saw him stand up, shaking and wiping the sweat out of his eyes, apparently at the top. He looked down and made gestures threateningly and shouted, but he was too far for John to hear his words. Next moment John leapt aside to save his limbs, for Virtue had sent a great boulder rolling down, and as its thunder ceased echoing in the gorge and John looked up again, Virtue had gone over the spur out of sight, and he saw no more of him. John sat down in the desolate place. The grass here was finer and shorter, such grass as sheep love, which grows in the quiet intervals between the rocks. The windings of the gorge had already shut off the sight of Wisdom's Valley, yet I saw that John had no thought save of going back. There was indeed a confusion of shame and sorrow and bewilderment in his mind, but he put it all aside and held fast to his fear of the rocks, and of meeting Virtue, now mad, in some narrow place whence he could not retreat. He thought, "I will sit here and rest till I get my wind, and then I will go back. I must live out the rest of my life as best I can." Then suddenly he heard himself hailed from above. A man was descending where Virtue had gone up. "Hi!" shouted the man. "Your friend has gone on. Surely you will follow him?" "He is mad, sir," said John. "No madder than you, and no saner," said the man. "You will both recover, if only you will keep together." "I cannot get up the rocks," said John. "I will give you a hand," said the man. And he came down till he was within reach of John, and held out his hand. And John grew pale as paper, and nausea came upon him. "It's now or never," said the man. Then John set his teeth and took the hand that was offered him. He trembled at the very first grip he was made to take, but he could not go back, for they were speedily so high that he dared not attempt the return alone, and what with pushing and pulling, the man got him right up to the top, and there he fell down on his belly in the grass to pant, and to groan at the pain in his chest. When he sat up, the man was gone. 3. John forgets himself. John looked back and turned away with a shudder. All thought of descending again must be put aside at once and forever. "That fellow has left me in a nice fix," he said bitterly. Next he looked ahead. The cliffs still rose high above him and dropped far below him, but there was a ledge on a level with him, a narrow ledge, 10 feet broad at its best and 2 at its worst, winding away along the cliff till it became but a green thread. His heart failed him. Then he tried to recall the lessons of Mr. Wisdom, whether they would give him any strength. "It is only myself," he said. "It is I myself, eternal spirit, who drives this, me, the slave, along that ledge. I ought not to care whether he falls and breaks his neck or not. It is not he that is real, it is I. Can I remember that?" But then he felt so different from the eternal spirit that he could call it I no longer. "It is all very well for him," said John, "but why does he give me no help? I want help. Help!" Then he gazed up at the cliffs and the narrow sky, blue and remote, between them, and he thought of that universal mind, and of the shining tranquillity hidden somewhere behind the colours and the shapes, the pregnant silence under all the sounds, and he thought, if one drop of all that ocean would flow into me now, if I, the mortal, could but realize that I am that, all would be well. I know there is something there. I know the sensuous curtain is not a cheat. In the bitterness of his soul he looked up again, saying, "Help! Help! I want help!" But as soon as the words were out of his mouth, a new fear, far deeper than his fear of the cliffs, sprang at him from the hiding place, close to the surface where it had lain against this moment. As a man in a dream talks without fear to his dead friend, and only afterwards bethinks himself, "It was a ghost, I have talked with a ghost," and wakes screaming, even so John sprang up as he saw what he had done. "I have been praying," he said. "It is the landlord under a new name. It is the rules and the black hole and the slavery dressed out in a new fashion to catch me, and I am caught. Who would have thought the old spider's web was so subtle?" But this was insupportable to him, and he said that he had only fallen into a metaphor. Even Mr. Wisdom had confessed that Mother Kirk and the stewards gave an account of the truth in picture writing, and one must use metaphors. The feelings and the imagination needed that support. "The great thing," said John, "is to keep the intellect free from them, to remember that they are metaphors." 4. John finds his voice. He was much comforted by this idea of metaphor, and as he was now also rested, he began his journey along the cliff path with some degree of timid resolution. But it was very dreadful to him in the narrower places, and his courage seemed to him to decrease rather than to grow as he proceeded. Indeed, he soon found that he could go forward at all only by remembering Mr. Wisdom's absolute incessantly. It was necessary by repeated efforts of the will to turn thither, consciously to draw from that endless reservoir the little share of vitality that he needed for the next narrow place. He knew now that he was praying, but he thought that he had drawn the fangs of that knowledge. "In a sense," he said, "spirit is not I. I am it, but I am not the whole of it. When I turn back to that part of it which is not I, that far greater part which my soul does not exhaust, surely that part is to me an other. It must become for my imagination not really I, but thou. A metaphor, perhaps more than a metaphor. Of course, there is no need at all to confuse it with the mythical landlord. However I think of it inadequately." Then a new thing happened to John, and he began to sing, and this is as much of his song as I remember from my dream. "He whom I bow to only knows to whom I bow, when I attempt the ineffable name, murmuring thou, and dream of Phadian fancies and embrace in heart meanings I know that cannot be the thing thou art. All prayers always taken at their word blaspheme, invoking with frail imageries a folklore dream, and all men are idolaters, crying unheard to senseless idols if thou take them at their word. And all men in their praying, self-deceived, address one that is not, so saith that old rebuke, unless thou of mere grace appropriate and to thee divert men's arrows, all that hazard aimed beyond desert. Take not, O Lord, our literal sense, but in thy great unbroken speech our halting metaphor translate." When he came to think over the words that had gone out of him, he began once more to be afraid of them. Day was declining, and in the narrow chasm it was already almost dark. 5. Food at a cost. For a while he went on cautiously, but he was haunted by a picture in his mind of a place where the path would break off short when it was too dark for him to see, and he would step on air. This fear made him halt, more and more frequently, to examine his ground, and when he went on it was each time more slowly, till at last he came to a standstill. There seemed to be nothing for it but to rest where he was. The night was warm, but he was both hungry and thirsty, and he sat down. It was quite dark now. Then I dreamed that once more a man came to him in the darkness and said, "You must pass the night where you are, but I've brought you a loaf, and if you crawl along the ledge 10 paces more, you will find that a little fall of water comes down the cliff." "Sir," said John, "I do not know your name, and I cannot see your face, but I thank you. Will you not sit down and eat yourself?" "I am full and not hungry," said the man, "and I will pass on. But one word before I go. You cannot have it both ways." "What do you mean, sir?" "Your life has been saved all this day by crying out to something which you call by many names, and you have said to yourself that you used metaphors." "Was I wrong, sir?" "Perhaps not, but you must play fair. If its help is not a metaphor, neither are its commands. If it can answer when you call, then it can speak without your asking. If you can go to it, it can come to you." "I think I see, sir. You mean that I am not my own man. In some sense I have a landlord after all." "Even so. But what is it that dismays you? You heard from wisdom how the rules were yours and not yours. Did you not mean to keep them? And if so, can it scare you to know that there is one who will make you able to keep them? Well, said John, I suppose you have found me out. Perhaps I did not fully mean to keep them, not all, or not all the time. And yet, in a way, I think I did. It is like a thorn in your finger, sir. You know when you set about taking it out yourself. You mean to get it out. You know it will hurt, and it does hurt, but somehow it is not very serious business. Well, I suppose because you feel that you always could stop if it was very bad. Not that you intend to stop. But it is a very different thing to hold your hand out to a surgeon to be hurt as much as he thinks fit, and at his speed. The man laughed. I see you understand me very well, he said. But the great thing is to get the thorn out. And then he went away. 6. Caught. John had no difficulty in finding the stream, and when he had drunk, he sat by it and ate. The bread had a rather flat taste, which was somehow familiar and not very agreeable, but he was in no position to be dainty. Extreme weariness prevented him from thinking much of the conversation that had just passed. At the bottom of John's heart, the stranger's words lay like a cold weight that he must some day take up and carry. But his mind was full of the pictures of cliff and chasm, of wondering about virtue and of smaller fears for the morrow and the moment, and above all the blessedness of food and of sitting still. And all these jumbled themselves together in an even dimmer confusion, till at last he could no longer remember which he had been thinking of the moment before. And then he knew that he was sleeping, and at last he was in deep sleep, and knew nothing. In the morning it was not so. Jump with his first waking thought, the full-grown horror leapt upon him. The blue sky above the cliffs was watching him. The cliffs themselves were imprisoning him. The rocks behind were cutting off his retreat. The path ahead was ordering him on. In one night the landlord, call him by what name you would, had come back to the world and filled the world, quite full, without a cranny. His eyes stared, and his hand pointed, and his voice commanded in everything that could be heard or seen, even from this place where John sat, to the end of the world. And if you passed the end of the world, he would be there too. All things were indeed one, more truly than Mr. Wisdom dreamed, and all things said one word, caught. Caught into slavery again, to walk warily and on sufferance all his days, never to be alone, never the master of his own soul, to have no privacy, no corner whereof you could say to the whole universe, this is my own, here I can do as I please. Under that universal and inspecting gaze, John cowered like some small animal caught up in a giant's hands and held beneath a magnifying glass. When he had drunk and splashed his face in the stream, he continued his way, and presently he made this song. You rest upon me all my days, the inevitable eye, dreadful and undeflected as the blaze of some Arabian sky, where, dead still in their smothering tent, pale travellers crouch, and bright about them noon's long-drawn astonishment hammers the rocks with light. Oh, for but one cool breath in 7, one air from northern climes, the changing and the castle-clouded heaven of my old pagan times. But you have seized all in your rage of oneness. Round about, beating my wings, always within your cage I flutter, but not out. And as he walked on all day, in the strength of the bread he had eaten, not daring often to look down into the gulf, and keeping his head mostly turned a little inward to the cliff, he had time to turn his trouble over in his mind and discover new sides to it. Above all, it grew upon him that the return of the landlord had blotted out the island. For if there still were such a place, he was no longer free to spend his soul in seeking it, but must follow whatever designs the landlord had for him. And at the very best it now seemed that the last of things was at least more like a person than a place, so that the deepest thirst within him was not adapted to the deepest nature of the world. But sometimes he comforted himself by saying that this new and real landlord must yet be very different from him whom the stewards proclaimed, and indeed from all images that men could make of him. There might still hang about him some of that promising darkness which had covered the absolute. 7. The Hermit. Presently he heard a bell struck, and he looked, and saw a little chapel in a cave of the cliff beside him, and there sat a hermit whose name was History, so old and thin that his hands were transparent, and John thought that a little wind would have blown him away. "Turn in, my son," said the hermit, and eat bread, and then you shall go on your journey." John was glad to hear the voice of a man among the rocks, and he turned in and sat. The hermit gave him bread and water, but he himself ate no bread and drank a little wine. "Where are you going, son?" he said. "It seems to me, father, that I am going where I do not wish, for I set out to find an island, and I have found a landlord instead." And the hermit sat looking at him, nodding almost imperceptibly with the tremors of age. "The clevers were right, and the pale men were right," said John, thinking aloud, "since the world holds no allaying for the thirst I was born with, and seemingly the island was an illusion after all. But I forget, father, that you will not know these people." "I know all parts of this country," said the hermit, "and the genius of places. Where do these people live?" "To the north of the road. The clevers are in the country of Mammon, where a stone giant is the lord of the soil, and the pale men are on the tableland of the tough-minded." "I've been in these countries 1,000 times, for in my younger days I was a peddler, and there is no land I have not been in. But tell me, do they still keep their old customs?" "What customs were those?" "Why, they all sprang from the ownership of the land there, for more than half of the country north of the road is now held by the enemy's tenants. Eastward it was the giant, and under him Mammon and some others. But westward, on the tableland, it was 2 daughters of the enemy. Let me see. Yes, Ignorantia and Superbia. They always did impose strange customs on the smaller tenants. I remember many tenants there, Stoics and Manichees, Sparitates and all sorts. One time they had a notion to eat better bread than is made of wheat. Another time the very nurses took up a strange ritual of always emptying the baby out along with the bath. Then once the enemy sent a fox without a tail among them, and it persuaded them that all animals should be without tails, and they docked all their dogs and horses and cows. I remember they were very puzzled how to apply any corresponding treatment to themselves, until at last a wise man suggested that they could cut off their noses. But the strangest custom of all was one that they practiced all the time through all their other changes of customs. It was this, that they never set anything to rights, but destroyed it instead. When a dish was dirty, they did not wash it, they broke it. And when their clothes were dirty, they burned them. It must have been a very expensive custom. It was ruinous, and it meant, of course, that they were constantly importing new clothes and new crockery. But indeed they had to import everything, for this is the difficulty of the tableland. It never has been able to support life, and it never will. Its inhabitants have always lived on their neighbours. They must always have been very rich men. They always were very rich men. I don't think I remember a single case of a poor or a common person going there. When humble people go wrong, they generally go south. The tough-minded nearly always go to the tableland as colonists from Mammon's country. I would guess that your pale men are reformed clevers." "In a kind of way, I believe they are. But can you tell me, Father, why these tough-minded people behave so oddly?" "Well, for one thing, they know very little. They never travel, and consequently never learn anything. They really do not know that there are any places outside Mammon's country and their own tableland, except that they have heard exaggerated rumours about the southern swamps, and suppose that everything is swamp a few miles south of themselves. Thus their disgust with bread came about through sheer ignorance. At home in Mammon's country they knew only the standard bread that Mammon makes, and a few sweet, sticky cakes which Mammon imported from the south, the only kind of southern product that Mammon would be likely to let in. As they did not like either of these, they invented a biscuit of their own. It never occurred to them to walk a mile off the tableland into the nearest cottage and try what an honest loaf tastes like. The same with the babies. They disliked babies because babies meant to them the various deformities spawned in the brothels of Mammon. Again, a moderate walk would have shown them healthy children at play in the lanes. As for their poor noses, on the tableland there is nothing to smell, good, bad, or indifferent, and in Mammon's land whatever does not reek of scent reeks of ordure. So they saw no good in noses, though 5 miles away from them a hay was being cut." "And what about the island, Father?" said John. "Were they equally wrong about that?" "That is a longer story, my son, but I see it is beginning to rain, so perhaps you may as well hear it." John went to the mouth of the cave and looked out. The sky had grown dark while they talked, and a warm rain, blotting out the cliffs like a steam, was descending as far as his eye could reach. 8. History's Words. When John had returned and seated himself, the hermit resumed. "You may be sure that they make the same mistake about the island that they make about everything else. But what is the current lie at present? They say it is all a device of Mr. Halfway's, who is in the pay of the Brown girls. Poor Halfways. They treat him very unfairly, as if he were anything more than the local representative of a thing as widespread and as necessary, though withal as dangerous, as the sky. Not a bad representative either, if you take his songs in your stride and use them as they are meant to be used. Of course, people who go to him in cold blood to get as much pleasure as they can, and therefore hear the same song over and over again, have only themselves to thank if they wake in the arms of media." "That is very true, Father. But they wouldn't believe that I had seen and longed for the island before I met Mr. Halfways, before I ever heard a song at all. They insist on treating it as his invention. That is always the way with stay-at-homes. If they like something in their own village, they take it for a thing universal and eternal, though perhaps it was never heard of 5 miles away. If they dislike something, they say it is a local, backward, provincial convention, though in fact it may be the law of nations. Then it is really true that all men, all nations, have had this vision of an island. It does not always come in the form of an island, and to some men, if they inherit particular diseases, it may not come at all. But what is it, Father? And has it anything to do with the landlord? I do not know how to fit things together. It comes from the landlord. We know this by its results. It has brought you to where you are now, and nothing leads back to him which did not at first proceed from him. But the stewards would say that it was the rules which come from him. Not all stewards are equally travelled men, but those who are know perfectly well that the landlord has circulated other things besides the rules. What use are rules to people who cannot read? But nearly everyone can. No one is born able to read, so that the starting point for all of us must be a picture and not the rules. And there are more than you suppose who are illiterate all their lives, or who, at the very best, never learn to read well. And for these people the pictures are the right thing? I would not quite say that. The pictures alone are dangerous, and the rules alone are dangerous. That is why the best thing of all is to find Mother Kirk at the very beginning, and to live from infancy with a third thing which is neither the rules nor the pictures, and which was brought into the country by the landlord's son. That, I say, is the best. Never to have known the quarrel between the rules and the pictures. But it very rarely happens. The enemy's agents are everywhere at work, spreading illiteracy in one district and blinding men to the pictures in another. Even where Mother Kirk is nominally the ruler, men can grow old without knowing how to read the rules. Her empire is always crumbling, but it never quite crumbles, for as often as men become pagans again, sends them pictures and stirs up sweet desire, and so leads them back to Mother Kirk, even as he led the actual pagans long ago. There is indeed no other way. Pagans, said John. I do not know that people. I forgot that you had travelled so little. It may well be that you were never in the country of Pagus in the flesh, though in another sense you have lived there all your life. The curious thing about Pagus was that the people there had not heard of the landlord. Surely a great many other people don't know either. Oh, a great many deny his existence. But you have to be told about a thing before you can deny it. The peculiarity of the pagans was that they had not been told, or if they had, it is so long ago that the tradition had died out. You see, the enemy had practically supplanted the landlord, and he kept a sharp watch against any news from that quarter reaching the tenants. Did he succeed? No. It is commonly thought that he did, but that is a mistake. It is commonly thought that he fuddled the tenants by circulating a mass of false stories about the landlord, but I've been through Pagus in my rounds too often to think it was quite so simple. What really happened was this. The landlord succeeded in getting a lot of messages through. What sort of messages? Mostly pictures. You see, the pagans couldn't read because the enemy shut up the schools as soon as he took over Pagus, but they had pictures. The moment you mentioned your island, I knew what you were at. I've seen that island dozens of times in those pictures." "And what happened then?" "Almost certainly the same thing has happened to you. These pictures woke desire. You understand me?" "Very well." "And then the pagans made mistakes. They would keep on trying to get the same picture again, and if it didn't come, they would make copies of it for themselves. Or even if it did come, they would try to get out of it not desire but satisfaction. But you must know all this." Yes, indeed. But what came of it?" "They went on making up more and more stories for themselves about the pictures, and then pretending the stories were true. They turned to brown girls and tried to believe that that was what they wanted. They went far south, some of them, and became magicians and tried to believe it was that. There was no absurdity and no indecency they did not commit, but however far they went, the landlord was too many for them. Just when their own stories seemed to have completely overgrown the original messages and hidden them beyond recovery, suddenly the landlord would send them a new message and all their stories would look stale. Or just when they seemed to be growing really contented with lust or mystery-mongering, a new message would arrive, and the old desire, the real one, would sting them again, and they would say, 'Once more it has escaped us.'" "I know, and then the whole cycle would begin over again." "Yes, but all the while there was one people that could read. You have heard of the shepherd people?" "I had been hoping you would not come to that, Father. I have heard the stewards talk of them, and I think it is that, more than anything else, that sickened me of the whole story. It is so clear that the shepherd people are just one of these pagan peoples, and a peculiarly unattractive one. If the whole thing is hobbled by one leg to that special people—" "This is merely a blunder," said history. "You and those whom you trust have not travelled. You have never been in Pagus, nor among the shepherds. If you had lived on the roads as I have, you would never say that they were the same. The shepherds could read. That is the thing to remember about them. And because they could read, they had from the landlord not pictures, but rules." "But who wants rules instead of islands?" "That is like asking who wants cooking instead of dinner. Do you not see that the pagans, because they were under the enemy, were beginning at the wrong end? They were like lazy schoolboys attempting eloquence before they learned grammar. They had pictures for their eyes instead of roads for their feet, and that is why most of them could do nothing but desire, and then, through starved desire, become corrupt in their imaginations, and so awake and despair, and so desire again. Now the shepherds, because they were under the landlord, were made to begin at the right end. Their feet were set on a road, and as the landlord's son once said, if the feet have been put right, the hands and the head will come right sooner or later. It won't work the other way." "You know so much, Father," said John, "that I do not know how to answer you. But this is all unlike the accounts I have heard of those countries. Surely some of the pagans did get somewhere." "They did. They got to Mother Kirk. That is the definition of a pagan, a man so travelling that if all goes well he arrives at Mother Kirk's chair and is carried over this gorge. I saw it happen myself. But we define a thing by its perfection. The trouble about pagans is that the perfect, and in that sense typical pagan, is so uncommon there. It must be so, must it not? These pictures, this ignorance of writing, this endless desire which so easily confuses itself with other desires and, at best, remains pure only by knowing what it does not want, you see that it is a starting point from which one road leads home, and 1,000 roads lead into the wilderness." "But were the shepherds not just as bad in their own way? Is it not true that they were illiberal, narrow, bigoted?" "They were narrow. The thing they had charge of was narrow. It was the road. They found it. They signposted it. They kept it clear and repaired it. But you must not think I am setting them up against the pagans. The truth is that a shepherd is only half a man, and a pagan is only half a man, so that neither people was well without the other, nor could either be healed until the landlord's son came into the country. And even so, my son, you will not be well until you have overtaken your fellow traveller who slept in my cell last night." "Do you mean Virtue?" said John. "That was his name. I knew him, though he did not tell me, for I know his family, and his father, whom he does not know, was called Nomos, and lived among the shepherds. You will never do anything until you have sworn blood brotherhood with him, nor can he do anything without you." "I would gladly overtake him," said John, "but he is so angry with me that I am afraid to come near him, and even if we made it up, I don't see how we could help falling out again. Somehow we have never been able to be quite comfortable together for very long. Of yourselves you never will. It is only a third that can reconcile you." "Who is that?" "The same who reconciled the shepherds and the pagans. But you must go to Mother Kirk to find him." "It is raining harder than ever," said John from the mouth of the cave. "It will not stop tonight," said Father History. "You must stay with me till the morning." 9. Matter of fact. "I see," said John presently, "that this question is harder than the clevers and the pale men suppose, but they were right in distrusting the island. From all that you have told me, it is a very dangerous thing." "There is no avoiding danger in our country," said History. "Do you know what happens to people who set about learning to skate with the determination to get no falls? They fall as often as the rest of us, and they cannot skate in the end." "But it is more than dangerous. You said it was beginning at the wrong end, while the shepherd people began at the right end." "That is true. But if you are a pagan by birth or by nature, you have no choice. It is better to begin at the wrong end than not to begin at all. And the most part of men are always pagans. Their first step will always be the desire born of the pictures, and though that desire hides 1,000 false trails, it also hides the only true one for them. And those who preach down the desire under whatever pretext, Stoic, ascetic, rigorist, realist, classicist, are on the enemy's side whether they know it or not. Then there is always need for the island? It does not always take the form of an island, as I have said. The landlord sends pictures of many different kinds. What is universal is not the particular picture, but the arrival of some message, not perfectly intelligible, which wakes this desire and sets men longing for something east or west of the world, something possessed, if at all, only in the act of desiring it, and lost so quickly that the craving itself becomes craved, something that tends inevitably to be confused with common or even with vile satisfactions lying close to hand, yet which is able, if any man faithfully live through the dialectic of its successive births and deaths, to lead him at last where true joys are to be found. As for the shapes in which it comes, I've seen many in my travels. In Pagus it was sometimes, as I said, an island, but it was often, too, a picture of people stronger and fairer than we are. Sometimes it was a picture telling a story. The strangest shape it ever took was in medium evum. That was a master stroke of the landlord's diplomacy, for of course, since the enemy has been in the country, the landlord has had to become a politician. Medium evum was first inhabited by colonists from Pagus. They came there at the very worst period in the history of Pagus, when the enemy seemed to have succeeded completely in diverting all the desires that the landlord could arouse into nothing but lust. These poor colonists were in such a state that they could not let their fancies wander for a minute without seeing images of black, craving eyes and breasts and gnawing kisses. It seemed hopeless to do anything with them. Then came the landlord's crowning audacity. The very next picture he sent them was a picture of a lady. Nobody had ever had the idea of a lady before, and yet a lady is a woman. So this was a new thing, which took the enemy off his guard, and yet at the same time it was an old thing. In fact, the very thing which he was reckoning on as his strongest point. He got the shock of his life. The people went mad over the new picture and made songs that are sung still, and looked away from the picture at the real women around them and saw them quite differently, so that ordinary love for women became, for a time, itself a form of the real desire, and not merely one of the spurious satisfactions offered to it. Of course, the landlord was playing a dangerous game. Nearly all his games are dangerous, and the enemy managed to mix up and corrupt the new message, as usual, but not so much as he wished, or as people afterwards said, and before he had recovered himself, one at least of the tenants had carried this new form of the desire right up to its natural conclusion, and found what he had really been wanting. He wrote it all down in what he called a comedy. "And what about Mr. Halfways?" said John. "Where did his kind of song begin?" "That was the last big arrival of new messages that we had," said History, "and it happened just before I retired from the world. It was in the land of Mr. Enlightenment, but he was very different then. I do not know any man who has deteriorated so with advancing years. In those days, claptrap had not been built. The enemy had agents in the country, but did not come there often himself. It must have been just about that time that Mammon was taking it over and building new towns and turning the people out of the fields into the factories. One of the results was a great deal of anemia, though there were other causes for that too, and weak hearts. This time the landlord did a curious thing. He sent them pictures of the country they were actually living in, as if he had sent them a number of mirrors. You see, he always does the last thing the enemy is expecting. And just as the pictures of the lady in Medium Evum had made the real women look different, so when men looked at these pictures of the country and then turned to the real landscape, it was all changed, and a new idea was born in their minds, and they saw something, the old something, the island west of the world, the lady, the heart's desire, as it were hiding, yet not quite hidden, like something evermore about to be, in every wood and stream and under every field. And because they saw this, the land seemed to be coming to life, and all the old stories of the pagans came back to their minds, and meant more than the pagans themselves ever knew. And because women also were in the landscape, the old idea of the lady came back too. For this is part of the landlord's skill, that when one message has died, he brings it to life again in the heart of the next. But out of this third revelation, which they called romantic, so many songs were made that I cannot remember all of them. And many deeds were done too, and many, through the usual false starts and disillusions and re-beginnings of desire, found their way home. Your Mr. Halfways is one of the later and weaker followers of that school. I don't think that the history of the romantic pictures is quite as clear as the other histories. What exactly was the landlord doing, and what did the enemy do? I thought you would have seen. This third stroke of policy was in a way one of the greatest. All the previous pictures had been of something that was not here in the world around you. This gave the enemy the chance of making people believe that you had it in the picture and lacked it elsewhere. In other words, that the picture itself was the thing you wanted. And that, as you know, means idolatry. And then, when the idol disappoints you, as it must, there is an easy passage to all the spurious satisfactions. But this weapon was knocked out of the enemy's hand when once the thing in the picture was the very same thing that you saw all round you. Even the stupidest tenant could see that you had the landscape, in the only sense in which it could be had already, and still you wanted. Therefore the landscape was not what you wanted. Idolatry became impossible. Of course, the enemy, when he had recovered himself, found a new method of defence. Just because the new message could not be idolized, it could be easily belittled. The desire awakened thus between the picture and the countryside could be confused with the ordinary pleasure that any healthy man feels in moving about out of doors. And when it had been so confused, the enemy could pretend that the romantics had made a great pother about nothing. And you can imagine that all the people who had not had pictures sent to them, and therefore not felt the desire, and therefore were itching with envy, would welcome this explanation. "I see," said John. "But still, on your own showing, all these messages get blurred and corrupted in the end, and then surely the thing to do is to look out for the new one. These pale men might be quite right to occupy themselves in cleaning away the rubbish of the old revelation. That might be the way to get ready for the next. That is another notion they have, which a little travel would soon blow to pieces. They think that the landlord works like the factories in Claptrap, inventing every day a new machine which supersedes the old. As machines are among the very few things that they do know something about, they cannot help thinking that everything is like them. But this leads them into two mistakes. First of all, they have no conception how slowly the landlord acts, the enormous intervals between these big changes in his type of picture. And secondly, they think that the new thing refutes and cancels the old, whereas in reality it brings it to a fuller life. Now, I have never known a case where the man who is engaged in ridiculing or rejecting the old message became the receiver of the new. For one thing, it all takes so long. Why, bless my soul, I remember Homer in Pagus ridiculing some of the story pictures, but they had thousands of years to run still, and thousands of souls were to get nourishment out of them. I remember Clopinel in Medium Evum jeering at the pictures of the lady before they had reached half his countrymen. But his jeer was no spell to evoke a new message, nor was he helping any cause but the enemy's. 10. archetype and ectype. There was a long silence in the cave, except for the sound of the rain. Then John began once more. "And yet," he said, "and yet, Father, I am terribly afraid. I am afraid that the things the landlord really intends for me may be utterly unlike the things he has taught me to desire." "They will be very unlike the things you imagine. But you already know that the objects which your desire imagines are always inadequate to that desire. Until you have it, you will not know what you wanted." "I remember that wisdom said that too, and I understand that. Perhaps what troubles me is a fear that my desires, after all you have said, do not really come from the landlord, that there is some older and rival beauty in the world which the landlord will not allow me to get. How can we prove that the island comes from him? Angela would say it did not." "You have proved it for yourself. You have lived the proof. Has not every object which fancy and sense suggested for the desire proved a failure, confessed itself after trial not to be what you wanted? Have you not found by elimination that this desire is the perilous siege in which only one can sit?" "But then," said John, "the very quality of it is so unlike what we think of the landlord. I will confess to you what I had hoped to keep secret. It has been with me almost a bodily desire. There have been times I have felt the sweetness flow over from the soul into the body, pass through me from head to foot. It is quite true what the clever say. It is a thrill, a physical sensation." "That is an old story. You must fear thrills, but you must not fear them too much. It is only a foretaste of that which the real desirable will be when you have found it. I remember well what an old friend of mine in medium Evum once said to me. 'Out of the soul's bliss,' he said, 'there shall be a flowing over into the flesh.'" "Did he say that? I did not suppose that anyone except the clevers knew it. Do not laugh at me, Father, or laugh if you will. I am indeed very ignorant, and I have listened to people more ignorant still." Twilight, hastened by the rain, had fallen on the canyon, and in the cave it was quite dark. John heard the old man moving to and fro, and presently there came the flame of a little lamp, lighting up his pale, bird-like face. He set food for supper before his guest, and bade him eat and then sleep. "Gladly, Father," said John, "for I am very tired. I do not know why I have plagued you with questions about the island. It is all a story of what happened to me long ago. It was long ago that I saw it clearly. The visions, ever since the first one, have grown rarer, the desires fainter. I have been talking as if I still craved it, but I do not think I can find any craving in my heart now at all." The old man sat still, nodding a little as before. Suddenly John spoke again. "Why should it wear out if it is from the landlord? It doesn't last, you know. Isn't it that which gives away the whole case?" "Have you not heard men say, or have you forgotten, that it is like human love?" asked the hermit. "What has that to do with it?" "You would not ask if you had been married, or even if you had studied generation among the beasts. Do you not know how it is with love? First comes delight, then pain, then fruit. And then there is joy of the fruit, but that is different again from the first delight. And mortal lovers must not try to remain at the first step, for lasting passion is the dream of a harlot, and from it we wake in despair. You must not try to keep the raptures. They have done their work. Manna kept is worms. But you are full of sleep, and we had better talk no more." Then I dreamed that John lay down on a hard bed in the cave, and as he lay between waking and sleeping, the hermit, as he thought, lit 2 candles at the back of the cave on an altar, and went to and fro doing and saying his holy things. And on the very borders of sleep John heard him begin to sing, and this was the song. "My heart is empty. All the fountains that should run with longing are in me, dried up. In all my countryside there is not one that drips to find the sea. I have no care for anything thy love can grant, except the moment's vain and hardly noticed filling of the moment's want, and to be free from pain. O thou that art unwearying, that dost neither sleep nor slumber, who didst take or care for Lazarus in the careless tomb, O keep watch for me till I wake. If thou think for me what I cannot think, if thou desire for me what I cannot desire, my soul's interior form, though now deep buried, will not die, no more than the insensible dropped seed which grows through winter ripe for birth. because while it forgets, the heaven remembering throws sweet influence still on earth, because the heaven, moved moth-like by thy beauty, goes still turning round the earth. Book 9. Across the Canyon. You will not sleep if you lie there 1,000 years, until you have opened your hand and yielded that which is not yours to give or to withhold. You may think you are dead, but it will be only a dream. You may think you have come awake, but it will still be only a dream. Open your hand and you will sleep indeed, then wake indeed. George MacDonald. You may as well come quiet. Police maxim. 1. Across the Canyon by the Inner Light. When John opened his eyes, the day was still far off, but there was light in the cave as though from 100 candles. The hermit lay fast asleep by one wall of the cell, as John lay by the other, and between them stood a woman, something like Reason and something like Mother Kirk, very bright. "I am Contemplation," she said. "Rise and come with me." "You are not like the Contemplation that I know," said John. "It is one of my shadows whom you have met," said the lady, "and there is little good in them and less harm, but rise and come." Then John rose, and the lady took him by the hand and led him out onto the ledge before the cave. And the night was still black with thunderous rain, but the lady and he were in a sphere of light, so that the raindrops, as they passed out of the darkness into it, became bright like diamonds in the centre of the sphere and iridescent at the circumference. Held by the lady's hand, he crossed the chasm and passed up the glens of the mountains on the other side. When they had travelled a long way, and still the darkness lay everywhere save where they trod, they came to the sea, and they crossed the sea also, gliding a little above the water, and the water also was dark until it reached their light, but within that it was blue as though it lay in Mediterranean sunshine. But presently the surrounding darkness vanished away, and the drop of light in which they had journeyed entered an ocean of light, and was swallowed up. The sky was visible above them, and it seemed to be early morning, for it was cool and dew-soaked their feet. And John looked and saw fields going up before him, and the light ran down as a river in the midst of the fields, singing with a voice like a river, but more articulate and very loud, too bright to look at. There were many people with them, and as John looked round upon the people, he saw that they were approaching some high walls and great gates, and at the shape of the towers clustered above him, a memory, very deeply buried, stirred in his mind, first sweet, then uneasy, then spreading through the pool of his mind in widening circles of dismay, till at last, with certainty, inevitable, unbearable, there flashed before him the picture of those turreted crags seen long ago from Puritania at the summit of the eastern mountains, and he saw where he was, beyond the brook, where Uncle George had vanished, at the landlord's castle, the good, kind landlord, with the black hole. He began to draw his hand out of the lady's hand. He could not get it free. She was leading him on to the castle gates, and all the crowd of people were moving on in the same direction, with a sinister happiness on their faces. He struggled with contemplation, and screamed, and with that and the struggling he awoke. 2. This Side by Lightning. It was now pitch black in the cave. Only the quiet breathing of the hermit recalled to John where he was, and with the first return of the knowledge he was already creeping out of the cave to dare the black night and the narrow ledge, to crawl the skin off his hands and his knees, to do and suffer anything so long as he was going back and not on in this direction where the next turning might lead him into the heart of his adversary's power. The rain fell in torrents, and thunder echoed among the rocks, but the cool moisture on his back was better than the hot moisture on his forehead. He did not dare to stand up and walk, for the new terrors had not driven out the old, but rather joined with them in a phantasmagoric harmony, so that all in one moment his inner eye saw the black hole full of the spiders and scorpions, the narrow ledge sloping horribly the wrong way, the drop into the darkness, and his own body bounced from crag to crag, the terrible face of Uncle George when the mask would not stay on it. And as the flashes came faster, and the thunder followed faster on each flash, a new fear joined the dance, and in each flash the timeless, unforgettable sight of the cliffs, lit up from end to end, gave a new edge to the old fear of climbing, and that again brought back the fear of Uncle George's face, So will mine look when I lie broken at the bottom of the gorge, until at last, when the complexity of fears seemed to admit no increase, a sharp, commanding voice out of the darkness suddenly startled him with such a shock that he seemed not to have been frightened till then. "Back," said the voice. John crouched motionless from the balance of fears. He was not even sure that he could turn on this bit of the ledge. "Back," said the voice, "or else show that you're the better man." The lightning tore open the darkness and flung it to again. But John had seen his enemy. It was Reason, this time on foot, but still mailed, and her sword drawn in her hand. "Do you want to fight?" she said in the darkness. John had a wild thought of catching one of the mailed ankles from where he crouched, but when he had a picture of Reason falling into the gulf, he could not get it clear of another picture in which he fell with her. "I can't turn here," he said. But the steel was at his throat, and turn he did. He shuffled along at a surprising speed, still on his hands and knees, till he had passed the cave again. It was no longer a question of plans or of ultimate escape. The hunted animal's impulse to prolong the chase kept him ragingly on the move. The flashes were growing rarer, and a star or two showed ahead. Then all of a sudden the wind shook the last raindrops fiercely in his face, and there was moonlight all about him, but he drew back with a groan. 3. This side by the darkness. Within an inch of him he had seen a face. Now a cloud crossed the moon, and the face was no longer visible, but he knew that it was still looking at him, an aged, appalling face, crumbling and chaotic, larger than human. Presently its voice began. "Do you still think it is the black hole you fear? Do you not know even now the deeper fear whereof the black hole is but the veil? Do you not know why they would all persuade you that there is nothing beyond the brook, and that when a man's lease is out his story is done? Because if this were true, they could in their reckoning make me equal to naught, therefore not dreadful, could say that where I am they are not, that while they are I am not. They have prophesied soft things to you. I am no negation, and the deepest of your heart acknowledges it. Else why have you buried the memory of your uncle's face so carefully that it has needed all these things to bring it up? Do not think that you can escape me. Do not think you can call me nothing. To you I am not nothing. I am the being blindfolded, the losing all power of self-defense, the surrender, not because any terms are offered, but because resistance is gone. The step into the dark, the defeat of all precautions, utter helplessness turned out to utter risk, the final loss of liberty. The landlord's son who feared nothing, feared me. "What am I to do?" said John. "Which you choose," said the voice. "Jump or be thrown. Shut your eyes or have them bandaged by force. Give in or struggle." "I would sooner do the first if I could." "Then I am your servant, and no more your master. The cure of death is dying. He who lays down his liberty in that act receives it back. Go down to Mother Kirk." John looked about him when next the moon shone. The bottom of the chasm was level far below him, and there he saw what seemed a concourse of dark figures. Amidst them they had left an open space where there was a glimmer as of water, and near the water there was someone standing. It seemed to him that he was waited for, and he began to explore the face of cliff below him. To his surprise it was no longer sheer and smooth. He tried a few footholds, and got 5 feet below the edge. Then he sat down again, sick. But the kind of fear which he now suffered was cold and leaden. There was no panic in it, and soon he continued his descent. 4. Securus te prodisi. On the floor of Peccatum Ade stood Mother Kirk, crowned and sceptred in the midst of the bright moonlit circle left by the silent people. All their faces were turned towards her, and she was looking eastward to where John slowly descended the cliff. Not far from her sat Virtue, mother naked. They were both on the margin of a large pool which lay in a semicircle against the western cliff. On the far side of the water that cliff rose sheer to the edge of the canyon. There was deep silence for about half an hour. At last the small, drooping figure of a man detached itself from the shadow of the crags and advanced towards them through the open moonlight. It was John. "I have come to give myself up," he said. "It is well," said Mother Kirk. You have come a long way round to reach this place, whither I would have carried you in a few moments, but it is very well." "What must I do?" said John. "You must take off your rags," said she, "as your friend has done already, and then you must dive into this water." "Alas," said he, "I have never learnt to dive." "There is nothing to learn," said she. "The art of diving is not to do anything new, but simply to cease doing something. You have only to let yourself go." "It is only necessary," said Virtue with a smile, "to abandon all efforts at self-preservation." "I think," said John, "that if it is all one, I would rather jump." "It is not all one," said Mother Kirk. "If you jump, you will be trying to save yourself, and you may be hurt. As well you would not go deep enough. You must dive so that you can go right down to the bottom of the pool, for you are not to come up again on this side. There is a tunnel in the cliff, far beneath the surface of the water, and it is through that you must pass, so that you may come up on the far side." "I see," thought John to himself, "that they have brought me here to kill me." But he began, nevertheless, to take off his clothes. They were little loss to him, for they hung in shreds, plastered with blood, and with the grime of every shire from Puritania to the canyon. But they were so stuck to him that they came away with pain, and a little skin came with them. When he was naked, Mother Kirk bade him come to the edge of the pool, where Virtue was already standing. It was a long way down to the water, and the reflected moon seemed to look up at him from the depth of a mine. He had had some thought of throwing himself in, with a run, the very instant he reached the edge, before he had time to be afraid, and the making of that resolution had seemed to be itself the bitterness of death, so that he half believed the worst must be over, and that he would find himself in the water before he knew. But lo, he was still standing on the edge, still on this side. Then a stranger thing came to pass. From the great concourse of spectators, shadowy people came stealing out to his side, touching his arm and whispering to him, and every one of them appeared to be the wraith of some old acquaintance. First came the wraith of old enlightenment, and said, "There's still time. Get away and come back to me, and all this will vanish like a nightmare." Then came the wraith of media halfways, and said, "Can you really risk losing me forever? I know you do not desire me at this moment, but forever? Think, don't burn your boats." And the wraith of old halfways said, "After all, has this anything to do with the island as you used to imagine it? Come back and hear my songs instead. You know them." The wraith of young halfways said, "Aren't you ashamed? Be a man. Move with the times and don't throw your life away for an old wives' tale." The wraith of Sigmund said, "You know what this is, I suppose. Religious melancholia. Stop while there is time. If you dive into insanity." The wraith of Sensible said, "Safety first. A touch of rational piety adds something to life, but this salvationist business, well, who knows where it will end? Never accept unlimited liabilities." The wraith of Humanist said, "Mere atavism. You are diving to escape your real duties. All this emotionalism after the first plunge is so much easier than virtue in the classical sense." The wraith of Broad said, "My dear boy, you are losing your head. These sudden conversions and violent struggles don't achieve anything. We have had to discard so much that our ancestors thought necessary. It is all far easier, far more gracious and beautiful than they supposed." But at that moment the voice of Virtue broke in. "Come on, John," he said. "The longer we look at it, the less we shall like it." And with that he took a header into the pool, and they saw him no more. And how John managed it, or what he felt, I did not know, but he also rubbed his hands, shut his eyes, despaired, and let himself go. It was not a good dive, but at least he reached the water head first. 5. Across the canyon. My dream grew darker, so that I have a sense, but little clear memory, of the things that John experienced, both in the pool and in great catacombs, paved sometimes with water, sometimes with stone, and upon winding stairways in the live rocks, whereby he and Virtue ascended through the inwards of the mountain to the land beyond Peccatum Ade. He learned many mysteries in the earth, and passed through many elements, dying many deaths. One thing has come through into my waking memory. Of all the people he had met in his journey, only wisdom appeared to him in the caverns, and troubled him by saying that no man could really come way he had come, and that all his adventures were but figurative, for no professed experience of these places could be anything other than mythology. But then another voice spoke to him from behind him, saying, "Child, if you will, it is mythology. It is but truth, not fact, an image, not the very real. But then it is my mythology. The words of wisdom are also myth and metaphor, but since they do not know themselves for what they are, in them the hidden myth is master, where it should be servant. And it is but of man's inventing. But this is my inventing. This is the veil under which I have chosen to appear even from the first until now. For this end I made your senses, and for this end your imagination, that you might see my face and live. What would you have? Have you not heard among the pagans the story of Semele? Or was there any age in any land when men did not know that corn and wine were the blood and body of a dying and yet living God? And not long after that, the light and colour, as with the sound of a trumpet, rushed back upon my dreaming eyes, and my ears were full of the sounds of bird and the rustle of leaves. For John and Virtue had come up out of the earth into the green forests of the land beyond the canyon. Then I saw that they were received into a great company of other pilgrims, who had all descended like them into the water and the earth, and again come up, and now took their march westward along the banks of a clear river. All kinds of men were among them. And during the whole of this part of their journey, reason rode with the company, talking to them at will, and not visiting them any longer by sudden starts, nor vanishing suddenly. It was a wonder to John to find so many companions, nor could he conceive how he had failed to run across them in the earlier parts of his journey. I watched this journey in my dream a long time. At the outset, their goal was heard of only by rumours, as of something very far off. Then by continuous marching, winding their way among the peaked and valleyed lands, I saw where they came down to the white beaches of a bay of the sea, the western end of the world, a place very ancient, folded many miles deep in the silence of forests, a place, in some sort, lying rather at the world's beginning, as though men were born travelling away from it. It was early in the morning when they came there and heard the sound of the waves, and looking across the sea, at that hour still almost colourless, all these thousands became still. And what the others saw I do not know, but John saw the island, and the morning wind blowing offshore from it brought the sweet smell of its orchards to them, but rarefied and made faint with the thinness and purity of early air, and mixed with a little sharpness of the sea. But for John, because so many thousands looked at it with him, the pain and the longing were changed, and all unlike what they had been of old. For humility was mixed with their wildness, and the sweetness came not with pride and with the lonely dreams of poets, nor with the glamour of a secret, but with the homespun truth of folk tales, and with the sadness of graves, and freshness as of earth in the morning. There was fear in it also, and hope, and it began to seem well to him that the island should be different from his desires, and so different that, if he had known it, he would not have sought it. 6. Nella sua volontade. How it fared with the other pilgrims I did not see, but presently a comely person took John and Virtue apart, and said that he had been appointed to be their guide. I dreamed that he was one born in the mountain, and they called him Steinsauger, because his sight was so sharp that the sight of any other who travelled with him would be sharpened by his company. "Thank you," said John. "Pray, do we take ship from here?" But Steinsauger shook his head, and he asked them to look at the island again, and specially to consider the shape of the crags, or the castle, for they could not well see which, at that distance, to which it rose at its highest point. "I see," said John presently. "What do you see?" said the guide. "They are the very same shape as that summit of the eastern mountain which we called the landlord's castle as we saw it from Puritania. They are not only the same shape, they are the same." "How can that be?" said John with a sinking heart, "for those mountains were in the extreme east, and we have been travelling west ever since we left home." "But the world is round," said the guide, "and you have come nearly round it. The island is the mountains, or if you will, the island is the other side of the mountains, and not, in truth, an island at all." "And how do we go on from here?" The guide looked at him as a merciful man looks on an animal which he must hurt. "The way to go on," he said at last, "is to go back. There are no ships. The only way is to go east again and cross the brook." "What must be, said John. "I deserve no better. You mean that I have been wasting my labour all my life, and I have gone half round the world to reach what Uncle George reached in a mile or so?" "Who knows what your uncle has reached, except the landlord? Who knows what you would have reached if you had crossed the brook without ever leaving home? You may be sure the landlord has brought you the shortest way, though I confess it would look an odd journey on a map." "How does it strike you, friend?" said John to Virtue. "It cannot be helped," said Virtue. "But indeed, after the water and the earth, I thought we had already crossed the brook, in a sense." "You will be always thinking that," said the guide. "We call it death in the mountain language. It is too tough a morsel to eat at one bite. You will meet that brook more often than you think, and each time you will suppose that you have done with it for good, but some day you really will." They were all silent for a while. "Come," said the guide at last. "If you are ready, let us start east again, but I should warn you of one thing. The country will look very different on the return journey." Book 10. The Regress. And if, when he returned into the cave, he were constrained once more to contend with those that had always there been prisoners, in judgment of the said shadows, would they not mock him, and say of him that by going up out of the cave he had come down again, with his eyes marred for his pains, and that it was lost labour for any so much as to try that ascent? Plato. "First I must lead the human soul through all the range of heaven, that she may learn how fortune hath the turning of the wheel of change, how fate will never turn." Bernardus Sylvestris. Let us suppose a person destitute of that knowledge which we have from our senses. Let it be supposed that in his drought he puts golden dust into his eyes. When his eyes smart he puts wine into his ears. That in his hunger he puts gravel into his mouth. That in pain he loads himself with the iron chains, that feeling cold he puts his feet in the water, that being frighted at the fire he runs away from it, that being weary he makes a seat of his bread. Let us suppose that some good being came to him and showed him the nature and use of all the things that were about him. Law. 1. The same, yet different. Then I dreamed that the guide armed John and Virtue at all points, and led them back through the country they had just been travelling, and across the canyon again into this country. And they came up out of the canyon at the very place where the main road meets it by Mother Kirk's chair. I looked forward in the same direction where they were looking, expecting to see on my left the bare tableland rising to the north, with Sensible's house a little way off, and on my right the house of Mr. Broad and the pleasant valleys southward. But there was nothing of the kind. Only the long straight road, very narrow, and on the left crags rising within a few paces of the road into ice and mist, and beyond that black cloud. On the right swamps and jungle sinking almost at once into black cloud. But, as it happens in dreams, I never doubted that this was the same country which I had seen before, although there was no similarity. John and Virtue came to a stand with their surprise. "Courage," said Slickestein Sauger. "You are seeing the land as it really is. It is long, but very narrow. Beyond these crags and ploughed on the north, it sinks immediately into the Arctic Sea, beyond which again lies the enemy's country. But the enemy's country is joined up with ours on the north by a land bridge called the Isthmus Sadisticus, and right amid that isthmus sits the cold dragon, the cold, costive, crustacean dragon, who wishes to enfold all that he can get within the curl of his body, and then to draw his body tighter round it, so as to have it all inside himself. And you, John, when we pass the isthmus, must go up and contend with him, that you may be hardened. But on the south, as soon as it passes into these swamps and this other cloud, the land sinks into the southern sea, and across that sea also there comes a land bridge, the Isthmus Masochisticus, where the hot dragon crawls, the expansive, invertebrate dragon, whose fiery breath makes all that she touches melt and corrupt. And to her you, Virtue, must go down, that you may steal her heat and be made malleable." "Upon my soul," said John, "I think Mother Kirk treats us very ill, Since we have followed her and eaten her food, the way seems twice as narrow and twice as dangerous as it did before. You all know, said the guide, that security is mortal's greatest enemy. It will do very well, said Virtue. Let us begin. Then they set out on their journey, and Virtue sang this song. Thou only art alternative to God, O dark and burning island among spirits, 10th hierarch, Wormwood, immortal Satan, Ahriman, alone, second to him to whom no second else were known. Being essential fire, sprung of his fire, but bound within the lightless furnace of thyself, bricked round to range in the reverberated heat from 7 containing walls, hence power thou hast to rival heaven. Therefore accept the temperance of the eternal love, only thy absolute lust is worth the thinking of. All else is weak disguisings of the wishful heart. All that seemed earth is hell or heaven. God is, thou art. The rest illusion. How should man live save as glass, to let the white light without flame, the Father, pass unstained? Or else, opaque, molten to thy desire, Venus infernal, starving in the strength of fire. Lord, open not too often my weak eyes to this. 2. The Synthetic Man. As they went on, Virtue glanced to the side of the road to see if there were any trace of Mr. Sensible's house, but there was none. It is just as it was when you passed it before, said the guide, but your eyes are altered. You see nothing now but realities, and Mr. Sensible was so near to nonentity, so shadowy even as an appearance, that he is now invisible to you. That mote will trouble your eyes no longer. I'm very surprised, said Virtue. I should have thought that even if he was bad, he was a singularly solid and foursquare kind of evil. All that solidity, said the guide, belonged not to him, but to his predecessors in that house. There was an appearance of temperance about him, but it came from Epicurus. There was an appearance of poetry, but it came from Horace. A trace of old pagan dignities lingered in his house. It was Montaigne's. His heart seemed warm for a moment, but the warmth was borrowed from Rabelais. He was a man of shreds and patches, and when you have taken from him what was not his own, the remainder equals naught. But surely, said Virtue, these things were not the less his own because he learned them from others. He did not learn them. He learned only catchwords from them. He could talk like Epicurus of spare diet, but he was a glutton. He had from Montaigne the language of friendship, but no friend. He did not even know what these predecessors had really said. He never read one ode of Horace seriously in his life, and for his Rabelais he can quote, "Do what you will." But he has no notion that Rabelais gave that liberty to his Thelemites on the condition that they should be bound by honour, and for this reason alone free from laws positive. Still less does he know that Rabelais himself was following a great steward of the olden days, who said, "Habe caritatem et fac quod vis," and least of all that this steward in his turn was only reducing to an epigram the words of his master when he said, "On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets." 3. Limbo. Then I dreamed that John looked aside on the right hand of the road and saw a little island of willow trees amid the swamps, where ancient men sat robed in black, and the sound of their sighing reached his ears. "That place," said the guide, "is the same which you called the Valley of Wisdom when you passed it before. But now that you are going east, you may call it Limbo, or the twilit porches of the Black Hole." "Who live there?" asked John, "and what do they suffer?" "Very few live there, and they are all men like old Mr. Wisdom. Men who have kept alive and pure the deep desire of the soul, but through some fatal flaw of pride or sloth, or it may be timidity, have refused till the end the only means to its fulfillment, taking huge pains often to prove to themselves that the fulfillment is impossible. They are very few because old Wisdom has few sons who are true to him, and the most part of those who come to him either go on and cross the canyon, or else, remaining his sons in name, secretly slip back to feed on worse fare than his. To stay long where he lives requires both a strange strength and a strange weakness. As for their sufferings, it is their doom to live forever in desire without hope. Is it not rather harsh of the landlord to make them suffer at all?" "I can answer that only by hearsay," returned the guide. For pain is a secret which he has shared with your race and not with mine. And you would find it as hard to explain suffering to me as I should find it to reveal to you the secrets of the mountain people. But those who know best say this, that any liberal man would choose the pain of this desire even forever, rather than the peace of feeling it no longer, and that though the best thing is to have, the next best is to want, and the worst of all is not to want. I see that, said John. Even the wanting, though it is pain too, is more precious than anything else we experience. It is as I foresaw, and you understand it already better than I can. But there is this also. The landlord does not condemn them to lack of hope. They have done that themselves. The landlord's interference is all on the other side. Left to itself, the desire without the hope would soon fall back to spurious satisfactions, and these souls would follow it of their own free will into far darker regions at the very bottom of the black hole. What the landlord has done is to fix it forever, and by his art, though unfulfilled, it is uncorrupted. Men say that his love and his wrath are one thing. Of some places in the black hole you cannot see this, though you can believe it. But of that island yonder under the willows you can see it with your own eyes. I see it very well, said John. Then the guide sang, God in his mercy made the fixed pains of hell, that misery might be stayed. God in his mercy made eternal bounds, and bade its waves no further swell. God in his mercy made the fixed pains of hell. 4. The black hole. Then there is, after all, said John, a black hole such as my old steward described to me. I do not know what your steward described, but there is a black hole, and still the landlord is so kind and good. I see you have been among the enemy's people. In these latter days there is no charge against the landlord which the enemy brings so often as cruelty. That is just like the enemy, for he is at bottom very dull. He has never hit on the one slander against the landlord which would be really plausible. Anyone can refute the charge of cruelty. If he really wants to damage the landlord's character, he has a much stronger line than that to take. He ought to say that the landlord is an inveterate gambler. That would not be true, but it would be plausible, for there is no denying that the landlord does take risks. But what about the charge of cruelty? I was just coming to that. The landlord has taken the risk of working the country with free tenants instead of slaves in chain gangs. And as they are free, there is no way of making it impossible for them to go into forbidden places and eat forbidden fruits. Up to a certain point he can doctor them even when they have done so, and break them of the habit. But beyond that point, you can see for yourself. A man can go on eating mountain apples so long that nothing will cure his craving for it, and the very worms it breeds inside him will make him more certain to eat more. You must not try to fix the point after which a return is impossible, but you can see that there will be such a point somewhere. But surely the landlord can do anything. He cannot do what is contradictory. Or, in other words, a meaningless sentence will not gain meaning simply because someone chooses to prefix to it the words, the landlord can. And it is meaningless to talk of forcing a man to do freely what a man has freely made impossible for himself. I see, but at least these poor creatures are unhappy enough. There is no need to add a black hole. The landlord does not make the blackness. The blackness is there already, wherever the taste of mountain apple has created the vermiculate will. What do you mean by a hole? Something that ends. A black hole is blackness enclosed, limited. And in that sense the landlord has made the black hole. He has put into the world a worst thing. But evil of itself would never reach a worst, for evil is vociferous, and could never in 1,000 eternities find any way to arrest its own reproduction. If it could, it would be no longer evil, for form and limit belong to the good. The walls of the black hole are the tourniquet on the wound through which the lost soul else would bleed to a death she never reached. It is the landlord's last service to those who will let him do nothing better for them. Then the guide sang, Nearly they stood who fall, themselves as they look back, see always in the track the one false step, where all, even yet, by lightest swerve of foot not yet enslaved, by smallest tremor of the smallest nerve might have been saved. Nearly they fell who stand, and with cold after fear look back to mark how near they grazed the Siren's land, wondering that subtle fate, by threads so spidery fine, the choice of ways so small, the event so great, should thus entwine. Therefore, O man, have fear, lest oldest fears be true, lest thou too far pursue the road that seems so clear, and step secure a hair's breadth past the hair-breadth bourne, which being once crossed forever unawares, denies return. 5. Superbia. Then they went further and saw in the rocks beside them on the left what seemed at first sight a skeleton, but as they drew nearer, they saw that there was indeed skin stretched over its bones, and eyes flaming in the sockets of its skull, and it was scrabbling and puttering to and fro on what appeared to be a mirror, but it was only the rock itself, scraped clean of every speck of dust and fibre of lichen, and polished by the continued activity of this famished creature. "This is one of the enemy's daughters," said the guide, "and her name is Superbia. But when you last saw her, perhaps she wore the likeness of 3 pale men." As they passed her, she began to croak out her song. "I have scraped clean the plateau from the filthy earth, earth the unchaste, the fruitful, the great grand maternal sprawling creature, lolling at random and supine, the broad-faced sluttish helot, the slave-wife, grubby and warm, who opens unashamed her 1,000 wombs unguarded to the liquorous sun. Now I have scoured my rock clean from the filthy earth. On it no root can strike and no blade come to birth. And though I starve of hunger, it is plainly seen that I have eaten nothing common or unclean. I have by fasting purged away the filthy flesh, the hot, moist, salt scrum, the obscenity and parasitic tetter from my noble bones. I have torn from my breasts, I was an uddered beast, my child, for he was fleshly. Flesh is caught by a contagion carried from impure generation to generation through the body's sewer. And now, though I am barren, yet no man can doubt I am clean, and my iniquities are blotted out. I have made my soul, once filthy, a hard, pure, bright mirror of steel. No damp breath breathes upon it, warming and dimming. It would freeze the finger if any touched it. I have a mineral soul. Minerals eat no food and void no excrement. So I, borrowing nothing and repaying nothing, neither growing nor decaying, myself am to myself a mortal god, a self-contained, unwindowed monad, unindebted and unstained. John and the guide were hurrying past, but Virtue hesitated. "Her means may be wrong," he said, "but there is something to be said for her idea of the end." "What idea?" said the guide. "Why, self-sufficiency, integrity. Not to commit herself, you know. All said and done, there is something foul about all these natural processes." "You had better be careful of your thoughts here," said the guide. "Do not confuse repentance with disgust, for the one comes from the landlord, and the other from the enemy." "And yet disgust has saved many a man from worse evils." "By the power of the landlord it may be so, now and then. But don't try to play that game for yourself. Fighting one vice with another is about the most dangerous strategy there is. You know what happens to kingdoms that use alien mercenaries." "I suppose you are right," said Virtue, "and yet this feeling goes very deep. Is it wholly wrong to be ashamed of being in the body?" "The landlord's son was not. You know the verses, 'When thou tookest upon thee to deliver man.'" "That was a special case." "It was a special case because it was the archetypal case. Has no one told you that that lady spoke and acted for all that bears in the presence of all that begets? For this country as against the things east and west, for matter as against form and patiency against agency. Is not the very word mother akin to matter? Be sure that the whole of this land, with all its warmth and wetness and fecundity, with all the dark and the heavy and the multitudinous for which you are too dainty, spoke through her lips when she said that he had regarded the lowliness of his handmaiden. And if that lady was a maid, though a mother, you need not doubt that the nature which is, to human sense, impure, is also pure." "Well," said Virtue, turning away from Superbia, "I will think this over." "One thing you may as well know," remarked the guide. "Whatever virtues you may attribute to the landlord, decency is not one of them. That is why so few of your national jokes have any point in my country." And as they continued their journey, Virtue sang, "Because of endless pride reborn with endless error, Each hour I look aside upon my secret mirror, trying all postures there to make my image fair. Thou givest grapes, and I, though starving, turn to see how dark the cool globes lie in the white hand of me, and linger gazing thither till the live clusters wither. So should I quickly die, Narcissus-like of want, but in the glass my eye catches such forms as haunt beyond nightmare, and make pride humble for pride's sake. Then and then only turning the stiff neck round, I grow a molten man all burning, and look behind, and know who made the lass, whose light makes dark, whose fair makes foul, my shadowy form reflected there, that self-love brought to bed of love may die, and bear her sweet son in despair. 6. Ignorantia. Still I lay dreaming, and saw these three continue their journey through that long and narrow land, with the rocks upon their left and the swamps on their right. They had much talk on the way, of which I have remembered only snatches since I woke. I remember that they passed Ignorantia, some miles beyond her sister Superbia, and that led the pilgrims to question their guide as to whether the ignorance of the tough-minded and the clevers would some day be cured. He said there was less chance of that now than there had ever been, for till recently the northern people had been made to learn the language of Pagus, and that meant, said the guide, that at least they started no further from the light than the old pagans themselves, and had therefore the chance to come at last to Mother Kirk. But now they are cutting themselves off even from that roundabout route. Why have they changed? Asked one of the others. Why did the shadow whom you call sensible leave his old house and go to practice Antakya in a hotel? Because his drudge revolted. The same thing is happening all over the plateau and in Mammon's country. Their slaves are escaping further north and becoming dwarves, and therefore the masters are turning all their attention to machinery, by which they hope to be able to lead their old life without slaves. And this seems to them so important that they are suppressing every kind of knowledge except mechanical knowledge. I am speaking of the subtenants. No doubt the great landowners in the background have their own reasons for encouraging this movement. There must be a good side somewhere to this revolution, said Virtue. It is too solid, it looks too lasting to be a mere evil. I cannot believe that the landlord would otherwise allow the whole face of nature and the whole structure of life to be so permanently and radically changed. The guide laughed. You are falling into their own error, he said. The change is not radical, nor will it be permanent. That idea depends on a curious disease which they have all caught, an inability to disbelieve advertisements. To be sure, if the machines did what they promised, the change would be very deep indeed. Their next war, for example, would change the state of their country from disease to death. They are afraid of this themselves, though most of them are old enough to know by experience that a gun is no more likely than a toothpaste or a cosmetic to do the things its makers say it will do. It is the same with all their machines. Their labor-saving devices multiply drudgery. Their aphrodisiacs make them impotent. Their amusements bore them. Their rapid production of food leaves half of them starving, and their devices for saving them have banished leisure from their country. There will be no radical change. And as for permanence, consider how quickly all machines are broken and obliterated. The black solitudes will someday be green again, and of all cities that I have seen, these iron cities will break most suddenly. And the guide sang, Iron will eat the world's old beauty up. Girder and grid and gantry will arise, iron forest of engines will arise, criss-cross of iron crotchet, for your eyes no green or growth, over all the skies scribbled from end to end with boasts and lies. When Adam ate the irrevocable apple, thou sawest beyond death the resurrection of the dead. Clamour shall clean put out the voice of wisdom, the printing presses with their clapping wings fouling your nourishment. Harpy wings, filling your minds all day with foolish things, will tame the eagle thought, till she sings parrot-like in her cage to please dark kings. When Israel descended into Egypt, thou didst propose both the bondage and the coming out. The new age, the new art, the new ethic and thought, and fools crying, because it has begun, it will continue as it has begun. The wheel runs fast, therefore the wheel will run faster forever. The old age is done, we have new lights and see without the sun. Though they lay flat the mountains and dry up the sea, wilt thou yet change as though God were a god? 7. Luxuria. After this, John looked up and saw that they were approaching a concourse of living creatures beside the road. Their way was so long and desolate, and he was footsore too, that he welcomed any diversion, and he cast his eyes curiously upon this new thing. When he was nearer, he saw that the concourse was of men, but they lay about in such attitudes and were so disfigured that he had not recognized them for men. Moreover, the place was to the south of the road, and therefore the ground was very soft, and some of them were half under water and some hidden in the reeds. All seemed to be suffering from some disease of a crumbling and disintegrating kind. It was doubtful whether all the life that pulsated in their bodies was their own. And soon John was certain, for he saw what seemed to be a growth on a man's arm slowly detach itself under his eyes and become a fat, reddish creature, separable from the parent body, though it was in no hurry to separate itself. And once he had seen that, his eyes were opened, and he saw the same thing happening all round him. And the whole assembly was but a fountain of writhing and reptilian life quickening as he watched, and sprouting out of the human forms. But in each form the anguished eyes were alive, sending to him unutterable messages from the central life which survived, self-conscious, though the self were but a fountain of vermin. One old cripple, whose face was all gone, but the mouth and eyes, was sitting up to receive drink from a cup which a woman held to his lips. When he had as much as she thought good, she snatched the cup from his hands and went on to her next patient. She was dark, but beautiful. "Don't lag," said the guide. "This is a very dangerous place. You had better come away. This is Luxuria." But John's eyes were caught by a young man to whom the witch had just come in her rounds. The disease, by seeming, had hardly begun with him. There was an unpleasant suspicion about his fingers, something a little too supple for joints, a little independent of his other movements, but on the whole he was still a well-looking person. And as the witch came to him, the hands shot out to the cup, and the man drew them back again, and the hands went crawling out for the cup a second time, and again the man wrenched them back and turned his face away and cried out, "Quick, the black sulphurous, never-quenched, old festering fire begins to play once more within. Look, by brute force I have wrenched unmercifully my hands the other way. Quick, Lord, on the rack thus, stretched tight, nerves clamouring as at nature's wrong, scorched to the quick, whipped raw. Lord, in this plight, you see no man can suffer long. Quick, Lord, before new scorpions bring new venom, ere fiends blow the fire a second time. Quick, show me that sweet thing which, spite of all, more deeply I desire." And all the while the witch stood saying nothing, but only holding out the cup and smiling kindly on him with her dark eyes and her dark red mouth. Then, when she saw that he would not drink, she passed on to the next. But at the first step she took, the young man gave a sob, and his hands flew out and grabbed the cup, and he buried his head in it. And when she took it from his lips, clung to it as a drowning man to a piece of wood. But at last he sank down in the swamp with a groan, and the worms, where there should have been fingers, were unmistakable. "Come on," said Virtue. They resumed their journey, John lagging a bit. I dreamed that the witch came to him walking softly in the marshy ground by the roadside, and holding out the cup to him also. When he went faster, she kept pace with him. "I will not deceive you," she said. "You see, there is no pretense. I am not trying to make you believe that this cup will take you to your island. I am not saying it will quench your thirst for long, but taste it nonetheless, for you are very thirsty." But John walked forward in silence. "It is true," said the witch, "that you never can tell when you have reached the point beyond which there is no return. But that cuts both ways. If you can never be certain that one more taste is safe, neither can you be certain that one more taste is fatal. But you can be certain that you are terribly thirsty." But John continued as before. "At least," said the witch, "have one more taste of it before you abandon it forever. This is a bad moment to choose for resistance, when you are tired and miserable, and have already listened to me too long. Taste this once, and I will leave you. I do not promise never to come back, but perhaps when I come again you will be strong and happy and well able to resist me, not as you are now." And John continued as before. "Come," said the witch, "you are only wasting time. You know you will give in the end. Look ahead at the hard road and the grey sky. What other pleasure is there in sight?" So she accompanied him for a long way, till the weariness of her importunity tempted him far more than any positive desire. But he forced his mind to other things and kept himself occupied for a mile or so by making the following verses. When Lilith means to draw me within her secret bower, she does not overawe me with beauty's pomp and power, nor with angelic grace of courtesy and the pace of gliding ships comes veiled at evening hour. Eager unmasked she lingers, heart sick and hunger sore, with hot dry jewelled fingers stretched out beside her door, offering with gnawing haste her cup, whereof who taste, she promises no better, thirst far more. What moves me then to drink it? Her spells, which all around so change the land, we think it a great waste, where a sound of wind, like tales twice told, blusters, and cloud is rolled, always above, yet no rain falls to ground. Across drab iteration of bare hills, line on line, the long road's sinuation leads on. The witch's wine, though promising nothing, seems in that land of no streams to promise best the unrelished anodyne. And by the time he had reached the word anodyne, the witch was gone. But he had never in his life felt more weary, and for a while the purpose of his pilgrimage woke no desire in him. 8. The Northern Dragon. Now, said the guide, our time is come. They looked at him inquiringly. We are come, said he, to that point of the road which lies midway between the two land bridges that I spoke of. The cold dragon is here on our left, the hot dragon on our right. Now is the time to show what you are made of. Wolf is waiting in the wood southward, in the rocks northward, raven wheeling in hope of carrion. Behooves you both be on guard quickly. God defend you. Well, said Virtue, and he drew his sword and slung his shield round from his back. Then he held out his hand first to the guide, and then to John. So long, he said. Go where it is least green, said Guide, for there the ground is firmest. And good luck. Virtue left the road and began to pick his way cautiously southward, feeling out the fen paths. The guide turned to John. Have you any practice with a sword? He said. None, sir, answered John. None is better than a smattering. You must trust to Mother Wit. Aim at its belly, an upward jab. I shouldn't try cutting, if I were you. You don't know enough. I will do the best I can, said John. And then, after a pause, there is only one dragon, I suppose. I don't need to guard my back. Of course there is only one, for he has eaten all the others. Otherwise he would not be a dragon. You know the maxim, serpens nisi serpentum comederit. Then I saw John also settle his gear and step off the road to the left. The ascent began at once, and before he was 10 yards from the road, he was 6 feet above it. But the formation of the rocks was such that it was like mounting a huge stair, and was tiring rather than difficult. When he first stopped to wipe the sweat out of his eyes, the mist was already so dense that he could hardly see the road beneath him. Ahead, the grey darkness shaded quickly into black. Then suddenly John heard a dry rattling sound in front of him, and a little above. He got a better grip on his sword and took one pace towards it, listening intently. Then came the sound again, and after that he heard a croaking voice, as of a gigantic frog. The dragon was singing to himself. Once the worm-laid egg broke in the wood. I came forth shining into the trembling wood. The sun was on my scales, dew upon the grasses, the cool sweet grasses and the budding leaves. I wooed my speckled mate. We played at Drury, and sucked warm milk dropping from the goat's teats. Now I keep watch on the gold in my rock cave, in a country of stones, old deplorable dragon, watching my hoard. In winter night the gold freezes through toughest scales my cold belly. The jagged crowns and twisted cruel rings, knobbly and icy, are old dragon's bed. Often I wish I hadn't eaten my wife. The worm grows not to dragon till he eat worm. She could have helped me watch and watch about, guarding the hoard. Gold would have been the safer. I could uncoil my weariness at times and take a little sleep, sometimes when she was watching. Last night under the moonset a fox barked, woke me. Then I knew I had been sleeping. Often an owl flying over the country of stones startles me, and I think I must have slept. Only a moment. That very moment a man might have come out of the cities, stealing to get my gold.
They make plots in the towns to steal my gold. They whisper of me in a low voice, laying plans, merciless men. Have they not ale upon the benches, warm wife in bed, singing, and sleep the whole night? But I leave not the cave but once in winter to drink of the rock pool, in summer twice. They feel no pity for the old lugubrious dragon. O Lord that made the dragon, grant me thy peace, but ask not that I should give up the gold, nor move, nor die. Others would get the gold. Kill rather, Lord, the men and the other dragons, that I may sleep, go when I will to drink.
As John listened to this song, he forgot to be afraid. Disgust first, and then pity chased fear from his mind, and after them came a strange desire to speak with the dragon, and to suggest some sort of terms and division of the spoil. Not that he desired the gold, but it seemed to him a not all ignoble desire to surround and contain so much within oneself. But while these things passed through his imagination, his body took care of him, keeping his grip steady on the sword hilt, his eyes strained into the darkness, and his feet ready to spring, so that he was not taken by surprise when he saw that in the rolling of the mist above him something else was rolling, and rolling round him to enclose him. But still he did not move. The dragon was paying its body out like a rope from a cave just above him. At first it swayed, the great head bobbing vertically as a caterpillar sways, searching for a new grip with half its length, while the other half rests still on the leaf. Then the head dived and went behind him. He kept turning round to watch it, and it led the volume of the dragon's body round in a circle and finally went back into the cave, leaving a loop of dragon all round the man. Still John waited till the loop began to tighten, about on a level with his chest. Then he ducked and came up again with a jab of his sword into the underside of the brute. It went into the hilt, but there was no blood. At once the head came twisting back out of the cave. Eyes full of cruelty, cold cruelty without a spark of rage in it, stared into his face. The mouth was wide open. It was not red within, but grey like lead, and the breath of the creature was freezing cold. As soon as it touched John's face, everything was changed. A corselet of ice seemed to be closed about him, seemed to shut in his heart, so that it could never again flutter with panic or with greed. His strength was multiplied. His arms seemed to him iron. He found he was laughing and making thrust after thrust into the brute's throat. He found that the struggle was already over, perhaps hours ago. He was standing unwearied in a lonely place among rocks, with a dead reptile at his feet. He remembered that he had killed it, and the time before he had killed it seemed very long ago. 9. The Southern Dragon. John came leaping down the rocks into the road, whistling a tune. The guide came to meet him, but before they had spoken a word, they both turned round in wonder at a great cry from the south. The sun had come out, so that the whole marsh glittered like dirty copper, and at first they thought that it was the sun upon his arms that made Virtue flash like flame as he came leaping, running and dancing towards them. But as he drew nearer, they saw that he was veritably on fire. Smoke came from him, and where his feet slipped into the bog holes there were little puffs of steam. Hurtless flames ran up and down his sword and licked over his hand. His breast heaved, and he reeled like a drunk man. They made towards him, but he cried out, "I have come back with victory got, but stand away, touch me not, even with your clothes, I burn red hot." The worm was bitter when she saw my shield glitter beside the shore. She spat flame from her golden jaw. When on my sword her vomit spilt, the blade took fire, on the hilt beryl cracked and bubbled gilt. When sword and sword arm were all flame, with the very heat that came out of the brute I flogged her tame. In her own spew the worm died, I rolled her round and tore her wide, and plucked the heart from her boiling side. When my teeth were in the heart, I felt a pulse within me start, as though my breast would break apart. It shook the hills and made them reel, and spun the woods round like a wheel. The grass singed where I set my heel. Behemoth is my serving man, before the conquering hosts of Pan, riding tamed Leviathan. Loud I sing, for well I can, Resurgam and Iopean, Iopean. Now I know the stake I played for. Now I know what a worm's made for. 10. The Brook. My dream was full of light and noise. I thought they went on their way singing and laughing like schoolboys. Virtue lost all his dignity, and John was never tired, and for 10 miles or so they picked up an old fiddler who was going that way, who played them such jigs, and they danced more than they walked. And Virtue invented doggerels to his tunes, to mock the old pagan virtues in which he had been bred. But in the midst of all this gaiety, suddenly John stood still, and his eyes filled with tears. They had come to a little cottage beside a river, which was empty and ruinous. Then they all asked John what ailed him. "We have come back to Puritania," he said, "and that was my father's house. I see that my father and mother are gone already beyond the brook. I had much I would have said to them, but it is no matter." "No matter indeed," said the guide, "since you will cross the brook yourself before nightfall." "For the last time?" said Virtue. "For the last time," said the guide, "all being well." And now the day was declining, and the eastern mountains loomed big and black ahead of them. Their shadows lengthened as they went down towards the brook. "I am cured of playing the stoic," said Virtue, "and I confess that I go down in fear and sadness. There were many people I would have spoken to. There were many years I would call back. Whatever there is beyond the brook, it cannot be the same. Something is being ended. It is a real brook. I am not one that easily flits past in thought the ominous stream, imagining death made for naught. This person, mixed of body and breath, to which concurred once only one articulation of thy word, will be resolved eternally. Nor can time bring, else time were vain, once back again the self-same thing. Therefore among the riddles that no man has read, I put thy paradox, who liveth and was dead. As thou hast made substantially, thou wilt unmake in earnest and for everlasting. Let none take comfort in frail supposal that some hour and place to those who mourn recovers the wished voice and face. Whom thy great exit banishes, no after age of epilogue leads back upon the lighted stage. Where is Prince Hamlet when the curtain's down? Where fled dreams at the dawn, or colours when the light is sped? We are thy colours, fugitive, never restored, never repeated again. Thou only art the Lord, thou only art holy. In the shadowy vast of thine Osirian wings, thou dost enfold the past. There sit enthroned antediluvian cruel kings. There the first nightingale that sang to Eve yet sings. There are the irrecoverable guiltless years. There, yet unfallen, Lucifer among his peers. For thou art also a deity of the dead, a god of graves with necromancers in thy potent rod. Thou art lord of the unbreathable transmortal air, where mortal thinking fails, night's nuptial darkness, where all lost embraces intermingle and are blessed, and all die, but all are, while thou continuest. The twilight was now far advanced, and they were in sight of the brook, and John said, I thought all those things when I was in the house of wisdom, but now I think better things. Be sure it is not for nothing that the landlord has knit our hearts so closely to time and place, to one friend rather than another, and one shire more than all the land. Passing today by a cottage, I shed tears, when I remembered how once I had dwelled there with my mortal friends who were dead. Years, little had healed the wound that was laid bare. Out, little spear that stabs, I, fool, believed I had outgrown the local, unique sting I had transmuted away. I was deceived into love universal, the loved thing. But thou, Lord, surely knewest thine own plan, when the angelic indifferences with no bar universally loved, but thou gavest man the tether and pang of the particular, which like a chemic drop infinitesimal, plashed into pure water, changing the whole, embodies and embitters and turns all spirits' sweet water to a stringent soul. That we, though small, may quiver with fire's same substantial form as thou, nor reflect merely, as lunar angel back to thee, cold flame, gods we are, thou hast said, and we pay dearly. And now they were already at the brook, and it was so dark that I did not see them go over. Only, as my dream ended, and the voice of the birds at my window began to reach my ear, for it was a summer morning, I heard the voice of the guide, mixed with theirs, and not unlike them, singing this song. I know not, I, what the men together say, how lovers die, and youth passes away. Cannot understand love that mortal bears for native land, all lands are theirs. Why at grave they grieve for one voice and face, and not receive another in its place. I above the cone of the circling night, flying, never have known more or lesser light. Sorrow it is they call this cup, whence my lip, woe's me, never in all my endless days must sip. Afterword to 3rd edition. On rereading this book, 10 years after I wrote it, I find its chief faults to be those two which I myself least easily forgive in the books of other men: needless obscurity and an uncharitable temper. There were two causes I now realize for the obscurity. On the intellectual side, my own progress had been from popular realism to philosophical idealism, from idealism to pantheism, from pantheism to theism, and from theism to Christianity. I still think this a very natural road, but I now know that it is a road very rarely trodden. In the early 30s I did not know this. If I had had any notion of my own isolation, I should either have kept silent about my journey or else endeavoured to describe it with more consideration for the reader's difficulties. As things were, I committed the same sort of blunder as one who should narrate his travels through the Gobi Desert, on the assumption that this route was as familiar to the British public as the line from Euston to Crewe. And this original blunder was soon aggravated by a profound change in the philosophical thought of our age. Idealism itself went out of fashion. The dynasty of Green, Bradley, and Bosanquet fell, and the world inhabited by philosophical students of my own generation became as alien to our successors as if not years but centuries had intervened. The second cause of obscurity was the unintentionally private meaning I then gave to the word romanticism. I would not now use this word to describe the experience which is central in this book. I would not indeed use it to describe anything, for I now believe it to be a word of such varying senses that it has become useless and should be banished from our vocabulary. Even if we exclude the vulgar sense in which a romance means simply a love affair, pier and film star romance, I think we can distinguish at least 7 kinds of things which are called romantic. 1. Stories about dangerous adventures, particularly dangerous adventures in the past or in remote places, are romantic. In this sense, Dumas is a typically romantic author, and stories about sailing ships, the Foreign Legion, and the Rebellion of 1745 are usually romantic. 2. The marvellous is romantic, provided it does not make part of the believed religion. Thus magicians, ghosts, fairies, witches, dragons, nymphs, and dwarfs are romantic. Angels less so. Greek gods are romantic, in Mr. James Stephens or Mr. Maurice Hewlett, not so in Homer and Sophocles. In this sense, Malory, Boiardo, Ariosto, Spencer, Tasso, Mrs. Radcliffe, Shelley, Coleridge, William Morris, and Mr. E.R. Edison are romantic authors. 3. The art dealing with titanic characters, emotions strained beyond the common pitch, and high-flown sentiments or codes of honour is romantic. I welcome the growing use of the word Romanesque to describe this type. In this sense, Rostand and Sidney are romantic, and so, though unsuccessfully, are Dryden's heroic dramas, and there is a good deal of romanticism in Corneille. I take it that Michelangelo is, in this sense, a romantic artist. 4. Romanticism can also mean the indulgence in abnormal, and finally in anti-natural moods. The macabre is romantic, and so is an interest in torture and a love of death. This, if I understand them, is what Monsieur Mario Praz and Monsieur D. de Rougemont would mean by the word. In this sense, Tristan is Wagner's most romantic opera. Poe, Baudelaire, and Flaubert are romantic authors. Surrealism is romantic. 5. Egoism and subjectivism are romantic. In this sense, the typically romantic books are Werther and Rousseau's Confessions, and the works of Byron and Proust. 6. Every revolt against existing civilization and conventions, whether it looked forward to revolution or backward to the primitive, is called romantic by some people. Thus, Pseudo-Ossian, Epstein, D.H. Lawrence, Walt Whitman, and Wagner are romantic. 7. Sensibility to natural objects, when solemn and enthusiastic, is romantic. In this sense, the Prelude is the most romantic poem in the world, and there is much romanticism in Keats, Shelley, de Vigny, de Musset, and Goethe. It will be seen, of course, that many writers are romantic on more than one account. Thus Morris comes in my first class as well as my second, Mr. Edison in my second as well as my third, Rousseau in my sixth as well as my fifth, Shelley in my sixth and fifth, and so on. This may suggest some common root, whether historical or psychological, for all 7, but the real qualitative difference between them is shown by the fact that a liking for any one does not imply liking for the others. Though people who are romantic in different senses may turn to the same books, they turn to them for different reasons, and one half of William Morris's readers do not know how the other half live. It makes all the difference in the world whether you like Shelley because he provides a mythology or because he promises a revolution. Thus I myself always loved the second kind of romanticism and detested the fourth and fifth kinds. I liked the first very little, and the third only after I was grown up, as an acquired taste. But what I meant by romanticism when I wrote The Pilgrims' Regress, and what I would still be taken to mean on the title page of this book, was not exactly any one of these 7 things. What I meant was a particular recurrent experience which dominated my childhood and adolescence, and which I hastily called romantic, because inanimate nature and marvellous literature were among the things that evoked it. I still believe that the experience is commonly misunderstood, and of immense importance. But I know now that in other minds it arises under other stimuli, and is entangled with other irrelevances, and that to bring it into the forefront of consciousness is not so easy as I once supposed. I will now try to describe it sufficiently to make the following pages intelligible. The experience is one of intense longing. It is distinguished from other longings by 2 things. In the first place, though the sense of want is acute and even painful, yet the mere wanting is felt to be somehow a delight. Other desires are felt as pleasures only if satisfaction is expected in the near future. Hunger is pleasant only while we know or believe that we are soon going to eat. But this desire, even when there is no hope of possible satisfaction, continues to be prized, and even to be preferred to anything else in the world by those who have once felt it. This hunger is better than any other fullness, this poverty better than all other wealth, and thus it comes about that if the desire is long absent, it may itself be desired, and that new desiring becomes a new instance of the original desire, though the subject may not at once recognize the fact, and thus cries out for his lost youth of soul at the very moment in which he is being rejuvenated. This sounds complicated, but it is simple when we live it. "Oh, to feel as I did then," we cry, not noticing that even while we say the words, the very feeling whose loss we lament is rising again in all its old bitter sweetness. For this sweet desire cuts across our ordinary distinctions between wanting and having. To have it is, by definition, a want. To want it, we find, is to have it. In the second place, there is a peculiar mystery about the object of this desire. Inexperienced people, and inattention leaves some inexperienced all their lives, suppose, when they feel it, that they know what they are desiring. Thus, if it comes to a child, while he is looking at a far-off hillside, he at once thinks, "If only I were there." If it comes when he is remembering some event in the past, he thinks, "If only I could go back to those days." If it comes a little later, while he is reading a romantic tale or poem of perilous seas and fairylands forlorn, he thinks he is wishing that such places really existed and that he could reach them. If it comes, later still, in a context with erotic suggestions, he believes he is desiring the perfect beloved. If he falls upon literature like Maeterlinck or the early Yeats, which treats of spirits and the like with some show of serious belief, he may think that he is hankering for real magic and occultism. When it darts out upon him from his studies in history or science, he may confuse it with the intellectual craving for knowledge. But every one of these impressions is wrong. The sole merit I claim for this book is that it is written by one who has proved them all to be wrong. There is no room for vanity in the claim. I know them to be wrong not by intelligence, but by experience, such experience as would not have come my way if my youth had been wiser, more virtuous, and less self-centered than it was. For I have myself been deluded by every one of these false answers in turn, and have contemplated each of them earnestly enough to discover the cheat. To have embraced so many false Florimels is no matter for boasting. It is fools, they say, who learn by experience, but since they do at least learn, let a fool bring his experience into the common stock, that wiser men profit by it. Every one of these supposed objects for the desire is inadequate to it. An easy experiment will show that by going to the far hillside you will get either nothing, or else a recurrence of the same desire which sent you thither. A rather more difficult, but still possible study of your own memories will prove that by returning to the past you could not find as a possession that ecstasy which some sudden reminder of the past now moves you to desire. Those remembered moments were either quite commonplace at the time, and owe all their enchantment to memory, or else were themselves moments of desiring. The same is true of the things described in the poets and marvellous romances. The moment we endeavour to think out seriously what it would be like if they were actual, we discover this. When Sir Arthur Conan Doyle claimed to have photographed a fairy, I did not, in fact, believe it. But the mere making of the claim, the approach of the fairy to within even that hailing distance of actuality, revealed to me at once that if the claim had succeeded, it would have chilled rather than satisfied the desire which fairy literature had hitherto aroused. Once grant your fairy, your enchanted forest, your satyr, faun, wood nymph, and well of immortality real, and amidst all the scientific, social, and practical interest which the discovery would awake,